Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the sound okay? It is. Welcome to Prague. Welcome to this meeting of Biodiversa Plus. Today we're doing the Science Policy Forum, and we're going to talk about the Global Biodiversity Framework. I'm Sibylle van den Hove. Actually, I was asked to moderate the afternoon. Hello, I see some familiar faces. I normally don't, this is not my normal life, moderating things, but I have been involved in biodiversity for many, many years. Less now I work more, I used to do a lot of biodiversity research, biodiversity science policy interfaces. It's probably why I'm here. Now I work more with businesses to try to foster their transformation towards sustainability. I'm still involved in two big programs, Eclipse, which is a science policy interface for biodiversity, and also BioAgora, which just started. I'm on the advisory board of those two things. Just wanted to tell you that today you'll have a lot of time for asking questions or making comments. So please get ready. We have a lot of people online. Hilde will talk about this. Of course, when you ask questions or make comments, please be concise so we can leave space for other people too. The meeting is going to be recorded, if that is okay for you, and then you can see it on YouTube if you missed part of it. And if you use social media, that's me. Please use this hashtag Biodiversa Prague 2023, and don't forget to tag Biodiversa Plus. That's all I wanted to tell you. So what we're going to do now, you have the program, but Hilde will introduce it. So please, Hilde, you know Hilde, everybody knows her. She's the star here, Hilde Eggermont. She's the chair and the coordinator of the project. Hilde, please, and you need this to change your slides.
Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you today to this Science Policy Forum. And before I kick off, I would like to thank a few people. First of all, of course, our Czech partner hosting this meeting in this beautiful venue. And then, of course, also Formas, who is in the leads of this Science Policy Forum with the colleagues from ENR, FRB, and also from ETAC, Estonia, supporting the organization. And then I'm also very happy that Sibylle is with us as a moderator. So thank you for accepting. So maybe first a few words on why we are here today. And that's, of course, the whole context of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And we try to see how we as Biodiversa Plus, with the partnership with all the partners, but also with the research that we fund and with the programs that we run, how we can contribute to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's at the heart of the discussions of today. And this Global Biodiversity Framework is not just like a quick update of the previous strategic framework. It's actually a very substantial, what we call package deal. I'll first go back. It's a package deal in the sense that it's holding these 23 concrete targets, the 4 goals. It's also including a decision on planning, monitoring, also reporting and review. We have a monitoring framework with indicators. We have a plan for research mobilization, so to really fund also the implementation. We have decisions on capacity building, on technical and scientific cooperation. So it's really a very extensive package when we speak about the Global Biodiversity Framework. And it's also a truly global framework in the sense that it's not only for the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it wants to be a framework also for the other biodiversity-related conventions, also for the 2 other Rio conventions, and also for the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we have this very emblematic target, which is the 30 by 30, that will also be central stage today. So we aim to protect at least 30% of our planets by 2030. And I know that the speakers that we have today with us will dive a bit deeper into the different aspects of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's also very important to realize that the Global Biodiversity Framework is very strongly building on the best available knowledge. We can see that if you just even read through the introduction of the framework, but of course also when you look into the targets, you can see that they build on a very strong knowledge base, most notably also the evidence that has been gathered by the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And actually the CBD, you may know that they are one of the main requesters for IPBES. And that also means that the findings of the IPBES assessments are consequently also used by the CBD parties to inform policy decisions. It's not only the science, but then we of course also need capacity building. We need also to generate the transdisciplinary knowledge. We need also to make sure that it's accessible, that knowledge and data are accessible, and also that we can then mobilize it where it is most needed at different scales. And then, of course, we bring it down to the regional level. Then we have the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030. Actually, Europe was a forerunner. Because we already had a strategy in May 2020. So we set actually also, or we helped to set the ambition also at the global level. So we have now this set of policy goals and measures to also protect and restore biodiversity in Europe by 2030. And so that is, of course, also the context of today's discussion, because you may know that Biodiversa Plus is part of the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030 to make the bridge between science, policy, and practice. And what is also key indeed in this, in the European Biodiversity Strategy, the colleagues from the Commission will speak to that, is also this 30 by 30, but also the setup of this ecologically representative, resilient, and also well-connected trans-European nature network that we will also discuss today. When it comes to Biodiversa, currently we have grown over the last couple of months. We are now 80 partners, so basically ministries of research and ministries of environment and environmental protection agencies from 40 countries, so European and associated countries. And we also have international collaborations. And we are co-designed and co-funded by the European Commission. So Biodiversa, the predecessor of Biodiversa Plus, together with DG Environment and with DG Research, have developed this partnership. We started in 2021. So we are just up and running for a little bit less than 2 years. And we hope to continue at least until 2028, and then we hope to have maybe a Biodiversa Plus. Let's see how it goes. We have several areas of work. I will not dive deep here, but what is still at the heart of Biodiversa Plus is the promotion of research. So every year we launch a major call for research proposals, transnational projects. And that's also one of the events that we have this week. Will kick off the projects that have been funded by the first call, which is called the Biodiv Protect. So we hope to launch these calls every year, so with a big amplitude of 40 million euros. There's also a specific focus on supporting the setup of a European observation network. So there's a big focus of Biodiversa Plus on biodiversity monitoring, but building on existing national and subnational biodiversity monitoring schemes. So not duplicating, but really reinforcing what is already in place in the different countries, and then also providing capacity for harmonization. Then we also have other areas of work that focus more on the science policy interfacing. The workshop that we have today is part of that stream of work. We also have a dedicated stream of work focusing on nature-based solutions and engagement with the private sector, and then also a focus on internationalization. So the work that we do as Biodiversa Plus to contribute to the IPBES. We are also hosting part of the secretariat of IPBES that is responsible for knowledge generation, but also our contribution to the CBD, and also interaction with global research infrastructures. So it's a quite encompassing portfolio of activities, with also several cross-cutting activities that run in parallel on stakeholder engagement, communication, open science, and all of that. So that was in terms of activities, but then we have a strategic research and innovation agenda. Basically, that determines the topics that we focus on, not only for the calls that we fund, but also for all the other activities that we support as Biodiversa Plus. So that is our Biodiversa strategic research and innovation agenda. And actually the themes that we have in that agenda are like a mirror the main working areas also of the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030. So it's like a blueprint of what you see in the European Biodiversity Strategy, but at the same time, we also selected topics that can fund groundbreaking science. So we really try to make a combination of both groundbreaking science, but also science that is of relevance to science and policy. Then, of course, we come to today's meeting, which is the Science-Policy Forum. It's actually the first meeting of 3 meetings. So tomorrow we'll have the kickoff of the 36 projects that were funded by the first call, which is called the Biodiv Protect. And then also there will be an internal meeting with these projects to start thinking about joint activities. But today we have here the Science-Policy Forum. With a good attendance on site, we should have around 100 people. And then online, we also had, actually the latest number said 200, but let's see how many are actually online joining us. And it's a quite diverse pool of people with the partners, with the projects that we fund, with people from our evaluation committee, with people from our advisory board and large stakeholder board, and then of course also the people from the European Commission, European Environment Agency, and a broader range of stakeholders and collaborators. So the main objectives of today are that everyone gets a bit of an update of what happened in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework and also the monitoring framework, that we learn about key biodiversity areas, because of course, if we say we have to protect 30%, we need to protect the right 30%. And we also see lots of similarities on the KBA program with what we do as Biodiversa Plus. So we thought it was a good opportunity to highlight that. And then we will also explore how we can build a coherent trans-European nature network of conserved areas, building on national experiences, but also looking at how the science that we fund can actually contribute to these goals. So you have an agenda. I will not go through the details, but basically in the first session, we will have a few keynotes that will set the scene. And then we will continue with 2 panels, one panel that will focus a bit more on the discussion of this trans-European nature network, and then another panel that will focus more on how we can support the knowledge base, also with the projects that we have funded in the past as Biodiversa. So with this, I will hand over again to Sibylle, and I wish you a very nice meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first thing we're going to do is to dive into the Global Biodiversity Framework. And for that, we have Julian Campbell. Where's Julian? She's over there from the CBD Secretariat. Julian, the floor is yours. And then you can get some questions ready for, we'll have time to ask her questions. You have your thing to change the slides there. I hope.
Okay. How do I start the presentation?
I think just push on the main button. There.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Good morning or good afternoon at this point. I'm still sort of on the US time zone. I apologize. And I am not going to go into detail or too much detail on what's on any of the slides, because based on the people who I think are attending this meeting, it seems that many of you are already very familiar with the Global Biodiversity Framework. And it was, as it was just mentioned, we also adopted a monitoring framework, which I believe that many people are also familiar with. So I will give just a quick overview of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the associated decisions. So as everyone knows, we had the Biodiversity Conference in 2022 in December in Montreal. There were a number of associated meetings at the conference. There was the COP Part 2, which is where all the decisions were adopted. There was also the COP MOPS. And so the timeline for leading up to COP 15 was very long. So there was a lot of work that went into the creation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We had additional time, of course, to get it right because of the fact that the COP was delayed for roughly 2 years. So there was the UN Biodiversity Conference in 2018. And then there was the work of the open-ended working group, which attempted to bring in scientific inputs and also negotiations on what the goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework could look like. And so that led us to the COP in 2015, where the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. So the major outcomes of this meeting that I think relate directly to the Global Biodiversity Framework are the actual adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is in the COP decision 15.4. This is where you can find the goals and targets. But there was a number of associated decisions that really provide information on how the decision will be implemented and monitored. And so the monitoring framework was adopted in decision 15.5. This includes a list of indicators for monitoring the Global Biodiversity Framework. The mechanism for planning, monitoring, reporting, and review was adopted in a different decision. This decision outlines when the national biodiversity strategies and action plans will be due. It outlines when there will be a global review of progress. So we would expect that national targets and national biodiversity strategies and action plans are developed prior to COP16. So that's just a year and a half away. And then there would be a global review of progress, which also looks at how well national targets align with the global targets by COP17. So in 3.5 years. And that decision outlines the use of the indicators in the monitoring framework in both the national plans and also in the national reports. And then there's a decision on resource mobilization and one on capacity building and development, which were adopted to accompany the GBF as well. So, oops, sorry, I tried to set a timer, but I set it for the wrong amount of time so that I wouldn't overtalk. Anyway, and then there was a decision on digital sequence information on genetic resources. Again, there was also the MOPS that met, and there were a number of decisions associated with that, which I won't go into detail. So in terms of the Global Biodiversity Framework, obviously this is the follow-up to the previous strategic plan from 2011 to 2020. In the 2011 to 2020 Aichi Biodiversity Plan or targets, none of the targets were fully met, and many of the targets were not even close to met, and there was a continuing loss of biodiversity in the last decade. And so this new framework is really trying to find a way forward towards transformation so that we as a global community are in a better position to reverse this trend in the next decade, and then of course continuing that positive trend in the next few years. And so a few of the main changes are really trying to focus on a more whole of government, whole of society approach, looking at ensuring that there's a monitoring framework and ensuring transparent monitoring, which is the reason why I think the monitoring framework was adopted, so that everyone's on the same page in terms of what needs to be done. And then there was a real focus on cooperation and partnerships, as opposed to seeing the convention as being just only about what the governments do. It's about what everybody does. And so I think I'll just go here. So these are the elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So although there is a lot of focus on the goals and the targets, there is also information that in the Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted that looks at the considerations for implementation, how things relate to the SDGs, the theory of change, and then these sections at the end on implementation, responsibility, and transparency and communication provide an overview, which then relates to the decisions that I mentioned at the beginning, which provide more information on those topics. The vision of the framework is to 2050. And the goals are also to 2050. And this is that biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and widely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. This relates to, of course, the 3 objectives of the convention. And the mission is then to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery for the benefit of people and planet by conserving and sustainably using biodiversity and ensuring the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources while providing the necessary means of implementation. So the goals and the targets link to trying to achieve this vision. There's 4 goals. I think people are mostly familiar with them. The goals relate more to the state of biodiversity and its use in the world, except for goal D. So you have a goal on ecosystems and extinction and genetic diversity. Then there's a goal on nature's contribution to people, a goal on genetic resources, and then the final goal is on means of implementation. And again, these are to 2050. So the idea is, where do we want the planet to be in terms of 2050? And then the targets are, how do we get to that? So the targets are not really outcome level information. It's more policy measures or actions that governments, people, businesses, researchers can take in order to take us towards those goals. I won't go into detail, but the targets can be grouped into 3 sections. There's targets relating to reducing threats to biodiversity. This includes the 30% of all areas are protected target, which has gotten a lot of attention, but it includes other targets related to reducing threats. I particularly think that target 1 is also very useful in the context of the framework, as it sets the stage for how all area is planned and managed and protecting biodiversity across not only protected areas, but across the entire country and world. Then there's targets related to meeting people's needs through sustainable use, benefit sharing. And then there's targets related to tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. These targets, a number of the targets in this section of targets, are more related to interaction with the business community, sustainable consumption and production, and policy measures. So there was also, as I said, so many decisions that were established in the GBF. One of the ones, let's see if I have it on the next slide. No, it was mentioned by the previous speaker, Hild, that there was also a decision, which I don't think I put on one of these slides, on the request to IPBES for assessments. That's decision 1519. And there was 4 requests to IPBES for assessments, which include an assessment on the monitoring framework, or not on the monitoring framework, but on monitoring biodiversity more generally, and looking at indicators that can be used to do that. The second assessment that was recommended relates to pollution. The third one relates to defining different definitions of value systems, including the value of Mother Earth. And the fourth one relates to looking at spatial planning and connectivity of different ecosystems. So those were the 4 that went to IPBES for their consideration. I believe that at least 3 of them will turn into actual assessments. So as I said, you can have the slides. I'll skip most of that. And then I wanted to quickly mention, in terms of implementation, this is really the focus right now from my perspective, and I think from a lot of the country's perspectives, is this rapid alignment of national targets and national plans our national biodiversity strategies and action plans with the Global Biodiversity Framework. And then there was an agreement to submit national targets to the next COP, or before the next COP, so that every country would submit national targets by COP16, which are aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework. This is a change from the previous strategic plan. In the previous strategic plan, countries submitted their national targets and their national NBSAPs, but they didn't commit to actually trying to align their own national targets with the global targets. So the Secretariat tried to do some alignment, but in this version, it's the responsibility of the country itself to do the alignment and send it. And then each COP will review the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. This includes through the establishment of an open-ended forum on implementation under the SBI. As I mentioned, the monitoring framework was adopted with indicators for tracking progress, and these indicators are then directly reflected in national reports as part of the template for national reporting. So the adoption of the headline indicators is not just an agreement to use the indicators, but they actually also do come into the national reporting template, which would then require countries to either submit information on that indicator or to say that they're not, but it's part of the template, so they would have to say something. So, and then it does include information again on mainstreaming. So just real quickly to conclude, there's a lot of work to do before the next COP and through the next decade and next however many decades that we want to sustain life on this planet, I suppose. But there will be a COP in 2024. This year, there will be a SAPSTA meeting in October. It's on the calendar. It's going to be in Nairobi in the middle of October. Then there will be another SAPSTA next year, along with the SBI. There will also be a working group on 8J, and on DSI in November of this year. There was the establishment of an ad hoc technical expert group on the indicators, which will report to the SAPSTA as well, and this will look at operationalizing the monitoring framework. And then there's also been an advisory committee on resource mobilization and on technical and scientific cooperation that have been agreed to. So as I said, I think I've already said this, the decision on the monitoring framework included different levels of indicators, headline indicators, which will be included in the national reporting template, and then binary indicators, which are sort of yes/no questions in the national reporting template, and component and complementary indicators, which are indicators that could be used, but it's at the discretion of people depending on the type of analysis that they're doing. And then this ad hoc technical expert group has been established to guide this work forward. So that is it. Thank you.
Please stay, Gillian, please stay for the questions and answers. Thank you very much. Great talk. Interestingly, you noticed that in the vision, we're still aiming at harmony with nature. We're still in the dualistic philosophy of the modernity. One day, maybe we will have harmony as nature and not with nature. Anyway, we have time for questions and comments. Anybody wants to start with a question? We have some mics around, and we also look at the people online, wherever you are. So, yes, please, we have a microphone there. Maybe say who you are when you take the floor, it's nicer.
My name is Volker Mofer. I'm from Mid-Sweden University, and I'm the project coordinator for the AlpMemo project in the last call, in this call. Yeah, thank you very much for your excellent overview. I have a question on the theory of change in the framework. How do you see the changes that happened at the COP to the theory of change? It was before in the first draft explicitly net improvements by 2050. And now there's something in there like biodiversity loss will be reduced and or reversed to allow for recovery by 2050. So that's a quite massive change in the theory of change. So how do you see this? Thank you.
Not sure how to answer your question. I mean, obviously in the negotiation, there was a lot of push and pull, and a lot of it, I think a lot of the negotiation came down to wanting to be ambitious, and at the same time, many people being concerned about feasibility and worried about, you know, if you adopt something that's not feasible, then what does this mean, and how does this affect your sort of implementation over time? And so I think that this is, you know, it's how the negotiation panned out. I will say, from my perspective at the Secretariat, the Global Biodiversity Framework in general is strong. I think that it's stronger than a lot of people expected it to be. And when you see the analysis that's been done of it, I do think that it, even though there was back and forth and as I said, ambition and feasibility, I think that the balance is probably close to right, and most countries are comfortable with it, which puts people in a good position to move forward with implementation. I also think there's a high level of ownership from the parties, which is good.
Thank you. Another question here, and then this gentleman there. Maybe over there first. I don't know who was first, and then you, Didier. Yes, please.
Okay. My name is Kofi Akamani, and I'm with the forestry program at Southern Illinois University in the US. So my question is about the great presentation, by the way. My question is the vision and mission focuses on 2050, but the implementation mechanism is targeting 2030. And so I see a gap there, you know, between the action and the goals to be realized. Could you elaborate on, you know, what implementation mechanisms are there to fill that gap? Thank you.
I mean, I think this is the theory of change. We know that changing the state of biodiversity takes time. So even if we fully implement all of the targets in the next year, to actually see a reversal in terms of loss, to see ecosystem extent increase, to see, you know, to see additional healthy populations, these things take time. They don't happen overnight. And so I think that the framework does a good job of recognizing that if we do these actions now, we will see the benefit, but we might not see the benefit and be able to capture it in terms of the indicators until later. There's a lag period. And so I think that that's this balance here. But again, it also gives the COP the ability in 10 years or 8 years now to review what's worked and what hasn't worked, and to then revise the targets. So there will certainly be additional targets that are adopted as part of this 2050 vision. Maybe they'll be the same, maybe there will be changes depending on how things go in the next decade. Thanks.
Didier?
Yes, I'm Didier Babin. I work on the negotiation of the CBD until 20 years, and I was in the Secretariat when we have adopted the Aichi targets. I'm not so sure that the actual global framework is so good. I think we make a lot of progress in terms of targets concerning conservation, on resource mobilization, things like that. But if we see on the second objective of the CBD, sustainable use of it, I think it's the actual negotiation is very weak. We still have no protocol on this second objective of the CBD. We have 2 protocols on the third and nothing on the first. So I'm not so sure that it's very, very strong, and I'm sure it's not enough to achieve what we want. I have a question concerning elements of target 19, where we have discovered a lot of new terminology in terms of financiarization of biodiversity. monetarization of biodiversity, like carbon credits, like blended finance, etc., without any safeguards in the discussion, without any definitions in the glossary. So my question is how the Secretariat will deal with that and manage before the next COP, from now to the next COP. Is there any working group working on that? I know that there is some external groups, but internally within the UN, is there any plan to work on that?
So, I mean, part of this will be part of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization. There's also an expert group on the financial reporting. So there are two different groups that were adopted at COP, which have been established to look at some of these issues. However, yeah, in terms of having solid definitions, hopefully we'll get closer. But it is, as I said, it is part of the work of this advisory committee, which I can find out much more if you would like, or you could talk to Marcus.
Thank you. We're going to go and see some of the questions or hear from some of the questions from our colleagues online, because they are frustrated. They are not in Prague, so they deserve some questions.
Yes. So one question that was put is more of a clarification, perhaps. Could you please elaborate on what degraded ecosystems cover, and if the 30% is meant to be within protected areas or outside or both?
So my interpretation from the negotiations is that this 30% is not related to protected areas. So obviously you would want to restore degraded ecosystems that are within protected areas, but also this definition of degraded should include all degraded ecosystems. And so there would be a lot that would be outside of protected areas. In terms of the definition of degraded, this is something that we are working on, providing guidance on. I mean, at this point, it would be up to parties to define degraded. However, we are working at the Secretariat in collaboration with the CCD and others to try to have a definition that will work in this context. And I also think that this is something that would come up in the IPBES assessment that I mentioned on spatial planning and connectivity. I can't remember the exact wording of that assessment, but this is also something that would come up there. But really, there's not a good definition or a data set that we can use at this point.
Thank you. Another question I heard from online. We'll take some more from you guys if you want.
Yes, okay. Another one from the audience online. When it comes to, for example, indicators, what capacity building opportunities are included in line with the decision 15.8 to increase national capacities? For instance, shall we look forward to info days or training courses on how to use the indicators in the future?
So we are trying to work with partners to create a series of training materials on the indicators, manuals, online training that people could attend to become more familiar with the different indicators. This is certainly something that we're working on. There's also all the metadata for the indicators is available online. If you go to post2020indicators.org, which we will change the name of the site, we just haven't yet, then you can see all of a quick guide on each indicator and what it is, which hopefully is a resource to countries. But this is not going to be enough. And so in the monitoring framework decision, in the capacity building decision, there is a direct reference to the need for efforts to build national capacity. This is something that is part of the GEF project, the Enabling Action Support Project, but the funding there is also small. So there's going to be a need to really look at how we do this.
Any other question from the room? Yes, microphone over there, please. This gentleman there, and another one there after. Then will be.
Yeah, Ralf Schulz from University Kaiserslautern-Landau in Germany. I have a question on target 7 on the pollution, because this is a very ambitious target that you have there, because you want to reduce pollution to levels that are not harmful to biodiversity and ecosystem functions, basically by 2030. But at the moment, we are in a situation that we roughly have 150,000 chemicals that are considered environmentally relevant by the US EPA. And for a few of them, we have toxicity data. But for more or less like 99%, we have no data at all. So how do you want to meet this target? Or isn't it clear, to pose the question a little bit different, that you will definitely not meet this target by 2030? And you just set it really to be on the way in order to reach it at some stage? Or how can I understand that?
I have similar problems, but I think I was talking to colleagues today about this exact target. We really do need guidance on how countries can interpret this target and what is the scope of it. Because as you said, it says pollution from all sources, and then there's specific sources that are mentioned later in the target. So you have nutrients, pesticides, and plastics. But these are 3 things, and the scope of pollution is huge. And then there's also a number of international or multilateral environment agreements on different forms of pollution that also have set certain goals, targets. They have indicators. And so I think that what we need is to provide guidance which helps countries make sense of that particular target. And it also provides linkages with these other processes, because I think a lot of the work on pollution is really going to happen in some of the other processes. And so it's important to have this link. Thanks. Not a good answer, sorry.
And last question over there.
Hi, Stephen Woodley with the IUCN. I'd just like to make a comment. It's not the Secretariat that's going to answer most of these questions. This is a party-led process. And if there are deficiencies in the process, it's because the parties negotiated a deficient outcome. I agree that the sustainable use part of the outcome is less than fulsome, but there are parties trying to provide guidance on this, and I think there's enough in all of these processes that we can make it work if we really want it to work. The GeoBond, for example, has put out a guidance document on sustainable use that people might refer to, and GeoBond has also put one out on restoration, which I was a co-author on, that may be of useful people who are talking about restoration, because it does address these comments of what is restored and what are we going to restore under the target 2 issue.
Thank you for the comment and for supporting Jill.
I agree completely.
Task.
I mean, we have a knowledge management role, but yes, we are not implementing the convention. So
There's one last question over there, or comment, or cry of support for Gillian.
Thanks for the presentation. That was very clear and very useful. I'd like to just get a bit more clarification on the ad hoc technical working group that's going to work on the monitoring indicators, because you said there's already guidance up online about the indicators. What are they mainly going to be looking at? Are they going to be looking at adding additional indicators, or are they going to revise existing indicators? Because we're interested about KBAs in particular.
yeah, so there's 4. If you look at the decision, there's 4 things that this technical expert group is going to do. And so it will provide guidance on the headline indicators that don't have an agreed methodology. So if you go to this website that I mentioned, there are a number of indicators where it's still at a conceptual stage. And so this metadata describes that. It says what's out there right now at this moment, but it doesn't take you all the way to where it's actually an indicator. So the AdTech will look at those indicators in particular. So that's this first item. It will provide guidance on the use of the indicators in national planning and reporting. I think this will be pretty straightforward, because it will just continue to recommend the headline indicators. And then also, I'm sure it will recommend the use of additional indicators moving forward. As part of that, as part of these first 2 objectives, there's also a focus on looking at disaggregation. So I think that for the KBAs, some of the KBA stuff would come into the disaggregation, actually. So in terms of protected areas, right now the indicator is just protected areas, but ideally we would want to have different disaggregations that are recommended. And this would include obviously simple level, just, terrestrial, freshwater, marine, but then you need to also have other disaggregations, including by key biodiversity areas. So I think that would come up in that work. And then there will be guidance on filling data gaps with sort of big data and new data sources, and looking at existing capacity, which would also look at how countries actually implement different aspects of the framework. And somebody from BirdLife is on the ATEC, and I'm sure we'll provide that link.
Well, thank you. And I think we can thank Gillian for a great presentation and great answers. Thank you so much. So the next presentation is from the European Commission, and they're going to tell us how the Union can contribute to the GBF. And for that, we have a double act, Francisco de Assis Sanchez Crespo and Bastian Bertsky. Francisco is from DG Environment from the Commission. He told me before that he's quite new, so we should be really tolerant with him. And Bastian is from DG Research and Innovation. Francisco, the floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much to all you for the opportunity of being here today. Perfect. Okay. I don't want to repeat again all the achievement of the COP15 because I'm quite sure that all of you already know them. So I want to focus on the work to be done by the European Union. Okay. Many of the initiatives of the European Green Deal are directly or indirectly relevant for the implementation of the KMF. So with the Green Deal, the European Union is already engaged in the path of the GBF agreement. In the months and years to come, we will carefully assess if there are any gaps we will need to fill. As a credible partner for others, we want to lead by an example. With this, we also hope to inspire others, because it's clear that the European Union cannot solve the problem alone. So we want to work with our partners to quick start the implementation. Biodiversity and COP15 became a top priority in our environmental engagement with third countries over the last years, and was mainstreaming in many of our multilateral processes. Biodiversity will continue to be a priority for international engagement on environmental issues. Important contribution of the European Union will be focused on a monitoring framework, research, capacity building, and knowledge. We are now discussing the mapping and gap analysis of policies and planning. And we are using existing governance structures, such as the European Union Biodiversity Platform and all its subgroups, the Working Party, and also the Working Party on International Environmental Issues and the Working Party on Environment will be used for interaction with the member states and other stakeholders. At COP15, the CBD adopted for first time a small set of global goals and targets together with the indicators to be used on monitoring parties' progress. So for the first time, we have at the same time that the agreements, a monitoring framework. Okay, the basic structure of these monitoring frameworks has been already explained by Gillian, so I think I'm going to pass over that. Only add maybe that the headline indicators, the main indicators, should meet or be able to meet by 2025 a list of criteria, including data metadata has to be publicly available. The methodology has to be published and peer-reviewed and validated for national use. Data is compiled and regularly updated. There has to be mechanisms for maintaining the indicators methodology. They should detect relevant trends, and they should be aligned, indicators should be aligned with existing processes, if possible. COP15 also took important decisions on capacity building. including knowledge management and the clearinghouse mechanism. This includes the development, led by the European Commission and the World Conservation Monitoring Center, of a global knowledge support service for biodiversity, notably for tracking progress on targets and goals on CBD and GBF. The capacity building targets include external capacity building and development, access to transfer of technology, and promote development of and access to innovation and technical and scientific cooperation, and strengthening scientific research and monitoring capacities. And second, to ensure the best available data, information, and knowledge are accessible to decision makers, practitioners, and the public. Within the European Union, the Knowledge Center for Biodiversity Steering Group will have a key role. This support service for biodiversity has the aim of supporting national capacity on biodiversity data, information, and knowledge. And now we face three different non-exclusive strategies. First one, to invest in national institutions related to biodiversity. Second, to promote and make possible the interoperability of data sharing. Okay. And to enhance collaboration at regional and global levels. Some consideration to finish. The current lack of proper indicators at an international level has been identified as an obstacle. The Commission is aware of the capacity need required for the COP15 GBF and its monitoring framework, and the supporting service is expected to contribute to them both. It is important that the support service is not only about data, but about knowledge in a broader sense, not a top-down instrument, but a service to the parties. So not only data is needed, but knowledge extracted from this data. So we need to process the data to make it usable. Also, the support service is expected to provide key support service on a need basis to the parties and other stakeholders. So to do that, it must be developing a way that it meets their needs. So the participation of stakeholders in the design phase is crucial, that parties can define their priorities and identify their needs. And finally, we need a governance structure and a financing mechanism developed for a long term. And to finish, okay, only to say that now there is an ongoing workshop in Cambridge that is co-designing precisely this support service these days. Okay, now I'm going to give the floor to...
We can congratulate Francisco first, and we continue. We'll ask questions after.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bastian Brötzky, and I'm working for the Research and Innovation DG in the European Commission. I'm also still quite new to my job. Having worked with biodiversity in protected areas for the last 20 years of my life, now I have the challenge that I need to cover everything else we do in 3 slides in less than 3 minutes, I think. So I'll be quick. Based on what Francisco said, I mean, there's a lot, of course, happening in the DG environment, in the implementation of the EU biodiversity strategy, in relation also to the global level, to the global knowledge support service. For us in research and innovation, one of the key challenges is that we really need to mainstream all the messages and needs coming from the GBF into our research and innovation policies and programs. And one of the important aspects here, I think, is this transformative change aspect, where we have already almost a dozen of projects we are funding with Horizon money on transformative change. And we had a recent cluster event for those in Brussels, which was really successful. But we really need to get this idea of transformative change also in all other clusters and pillars of Horizon and future framework programs, and also cover other sectors, of course, and trigger transformative change there for biodiversity. Another important aspect is the preparation and promotion of this ratcheting up of the biodiversity conservation through policies driving research. So we will every year, every other year, we will review what we have been funding, what are the key messages coming from that, what do we need to catalyze further in future work programs, and also then, of course, in the framework program 10 in the future. Very important for us, and that's where also the word biodiversity partnership comes in, is to strengthen the coherence between the EU and its member states in the approaches to science-based activities in relation to the GBF implementation, also with regard to the targets and indicators and monitoring and reporting. We want to have a coherent approach here. We want to make sure that we are funding research that complements, that adds value. And that's something we do through the partnership, but also, of course, in direct consultation with the member states and our other policy DGs. Another important aspect, I think, for the EU is that we have learned a lot, of course, in Europe, and there's tools and approaches and instruments that we would like to see being used in other parts of the world that can serve as examples, that can offer models, but also we should be open, of course, to learn from other parts of the world. And our research, the research that we fund, should help us to support this. We also need to strengthen further EU involvement and also the involvement of other partners, associated countries, and so on in the IPBES forum that was mentioned earlier by Hilde. And we do this directly by funding IPBES, but we're also doing this indirectly by funding in the future an action that will support the uptake of e-research and IPBES and also support other countries in contributing more research to IPBES. Another important point is, of course, the broader uptake of research and innovation outcomes through dissemination exploitation, taking research from the scientific world into the policy and society world. I see that here all on the posters. That's very cool. And that's, of course, again, something where a number of our strategic partners come into the picture. And I will conclude with that in a minute. So more concretely, I think what we in our DG have to do is really to take key messages, key needs from the GBF. And this relates to the indicators, this relates to the conservation measures, this relates to monitoring, reporting, this relates to translation into societal transformation and so on. We need to take that, we need to mainstream this into our strategic planning that is going on right now for the next work program 25-27, across clusters, across pillars. We also need to get our Green Deal missions, the 4 missions dealing with soils, oceans and waters, adaptation to climate change and cities, to reflect on the GBF and how they can contribute to the implementation. The same needs to happen and is already happening with the European partnerships, especially Biodiversa, of course, but there are also partnerships, other partnerships that are relevant, such as Water for All, Blue Economy. There is a number of other partnerships still being launched and planned, including on agroecology, on forests and forestry, that they all can play a role in the implementation of the GBF and different aspects of it, and the mainstreaming of biodiversity into other sectors. And then we in-house, together with our policy DGs, ENF, and also our colleagues in REA and other partners, we will develop a long-term strategic research agenda for biodiversity, which will also take account, of course, of the needs of the GBF. And we have, of course, the overall financial goal that we increase the funding for biodiversity-related research over time in the multi-annual financial framework. Final slide. It's a complex picture. 20 seconds. It's a complex picture, but we have a number of very strategic initiatives we are now funding that are in place or will be in place very soon, including the partnership BioAgora, a project tasked to set up the science service for biodiversity, Co-op for CBD, a project that recently started and that helps us to increase and enhance support and cooperation for the CBD. We also will launch a new project on IPBES support. We are funding IPBES Secretariat directly, and also we have Europa Bonn helping us to design the European monitoring observation system, network, coordination center, and so on. So all of this comes hopefully together nicely over the coming years, will require a lot of coordination and consultation, but there's lots of things in place that can help us implement the GBF and also feeding research into the policy that helps doing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bastian. You don't know how lucky you are. I remember the days when we were struggling to have biodiversity in the framework program. So you've gone a long way. Questions? You were not born. Questions?
Well,
maybe we'll talk about it. You look young. Anybody has a question? Otherwise, we have one online already. These guys are more awake than you are. We'll take the one online first and see if we have time, and then
Okay, so considering the complex nature of the biodiversity protection that requires trade-offs and collaborations among the stakeholders, are there any specific measurements or measures or recommendations to ensure co-responsibility and co-ownership by all relevant actors in meeting the EU's commitments on biodiversity?
Francisco, that's for you. Do we have a mic that we can give you maybe so you don't have to? There you go. So the issue of cross-sectoral ownership.
I don't know, maybe I suppose I can take note of the question and I will send you the answer.
No, I see what we can say is, so we have also worked a lot on the EU biodiversity governance system and have the EU biodiversity platform and different subgroups and expert groups. All of this has been revamped and involves now stakeholders across the board from different sectors, from different parts of the civil society, the member states, of course, and so on. I think so. Very importantly for us is of course to listen to all these voices, to have them on board, to get that buy-in into what we do, into shaping like the priorities for future research, but also thinking about how we can take research results and help raising awareness across board for the necessary measures, because I think some of these measures will be quite painful, if you like, for parts of the society maybe, and for some of the things we business as usual, right? So we need to also get this broader support, and that's where we as a commission, I mean, we are engaged with all the different stakeholders in all these processes, and we have set up also this governance structure in such a way that we can now listen to stakeholders, and also we can feedback our results and our activities to them in a very proactive way.
Thank you. Sorry, Volker, but we're going to go to the next presentation. Maybe you can ask your question at coffee break. So thank you very much again. And our next speaker is Andrew Plumter. I don't know if I pronounce your name well, Andrew. And Andrew is going to talk about key biodiversity areas, and you have a thing to change.
Okay, thank you to Biodiversa, and thank you everyone for turning up. I'm going to be talking about how key biodiversity areas are relevant to both the GBF and to the EU biodiversity strategy. And I head the Key Biodiversity Area Secretariat, which works for the 13 Key Biodiversity Area partners. So we have both the EU biodiversity strategy and the Global Biodiversity Framework. We've heard a bit about each of those this earlier. And there are different areas where I believe KBAs are relevant to both the EU biodiversity strategy and the Global Biodiversity Framework. People tend to think of key biodiversity areas as being just important areas for biodiversity, but they also have a role in playing in mainstreaming, in spatial planning, and in the private sector. And I'll show you some of those relevances in the next few slides. The clear area where they do have an importance are in Target 1 and Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, where there's this text, areas of high biodiversity importance in Target 1, and especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity in Target 3. The same phrasing, identical phrasing, was used in Aichi Target 11, and I know there are people in this room who basically wrote papers saying that we failed to achieve the increase in protection that we did get in areas of importance for biodiversity. We pushed very hard to get KBAs specifically mentioned in the target language, but there was pushback on that. But I hope what I believe that we need to do is clearly define what we mean by areas of particular importance for biodiversity, because OECMs have been defined in Aichi Target 11. They were basically put in there, and what people think of as OECMs is very different depending on who you talk to. And OECMs have to be in areas of particular importance for biodiversity if we're going to halt extinction and bend the curve. So KBAs have a global standard that was produced in 2016. This was based on about 5 years of consultation with the conservation community at different global fora. And it has specific definitions and quantitative criteria. That's important because it makes a KBA in one country equivalent to a KBA in another country. And you identify KBAs in an objective and repeatable approach, which means that governments and donors and the private sector can all accept them as being standardized across countries. The criteria based on 5 overarching criteria. There's actually specifically 11 criteria, but they're in these 5 overarching criteria. Threatened biodiversity talks about threatened species and threatened ecosystems. Geographically restricted biodiversity looks at individually geographically restricted populations of species, geographically restricted assemblages of species, and restricted ecosystems. Criterion C looks at ecological integrity, so areas of outstanding ecological integrity. Biological processes looks at important areas for breeding, spawning, or areas that are refugia during times of stress. And then finally, irreplaceability, which are areas that cannot be replaced by any other site. When the KBI criteria were being developed, they consulted different groups that have their own criteria. So the Alliance for Zero Extinction, important plant areas, important bird and biodiversity areas. And the idea was to try and capture all the different approaches and be able to apply it across all biomes, so terrestrial, freshwater, marine, and subterranean, and the main conservation objectives that people had, those ones that I've just gone through before. What you see here is that KBAs do an effective job at capturing those other processes. Key biodiversity area data are all available on the Key Biodiversity Area website. There's over 16,000 sites already identified. That's the largest database of any databases of sites of importance for biodiversity anywhere. 99% of those KBAs in Europe are Natura 2000 sites, so there's no great conflict with the Natura 2000 process. What you do notice is that the KBAs were built on the important bird and biodiversity areas process. So many KBAs have been identified fairly comprehensively for birds, but they haven't been identified for other taxonomic groups. And that's what we're working on at the moment with countries around the world, is to broaden that identification of KBAs. If you compare the global set of trigger species where birds are the dark green with the EU trigger species where birds are the light green, you can see that we're doing better elsewhere than in Europe. In Europe, it's about 78% are still triggered by birds. So what we're encouraging is that countries in EU identify their KBAs for other taxonomic groups. We're also developing a monitoring platform and partnering with Planet to basically monitor KBAs remotely using their satellite imagery, but also monitoring the biodiversity elements that trigger KBA status at sites around the world. And that would then be able to feed into outcomes such as PAIM or other measures of effectiveness of sites. KBAs are already indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. They were indicators of the Aichi Target 11, and they are in there as component indicators of the current framework, which is why I was interested in finding out whether they will remain there or not, of the Global Biodiversity Framework. They're also used by IPBES, but it basically it's the protected area and OECM coverage of KBAs is the indicator. In the Global Biodiversity Framework as a one of the additional indicators, we've got KBAs in favorable condition, because we feel that's actually more important in being able to assess how well KBAs are being conserved. Donors are using KBAs to guide where they're going to be putting their funding. We'll be hearing a bit later about how the EU Horizon Project and Biodiversa have been supporting KBA scoping. KfW uses KBAs in their legacy landscapes. AFD is starting to fund a program of KBA assessments in Southern Africa, which is South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, and Malawi. The Bezos Earth Fund has been funding KBA identification in the Congo Basin and the Andes. GEF, as in both GEF 7 and GEF 8, stated that they will only fund new protected areas if they meet KBA status KBAs are also being used by the private sector, and it's important to realize the private sector want one database they can go to where they can find these are the areas of importance for biodiversity that we have to try and avoid. They don't want to be going to here for something on mammals, here for something on plants, here for something on birds. They just can't cope with that. So trying to put everything in one standard database is important to them. The International Finance Corporation is using KBAs as likely critical habitat, and as a result, the Equator Principles, the 130 odd banks that sign up to the Equator Principles, also try and avoid KBAs. The Banks and Biodiversity No-Go Policy is a group of NGOs and banks that are trying to push for certain policies, one of which is to avoid impacting KBAs negatively. There's KBA language being proposed in the disclosure agreements that are being developed at the moment, such as TNFD, SBTN, and GRI. And finally, we have some guidelines on businesses for governments. KBA data being used on quite a few different platforms as well. So RepRisk, which is a reputation risk for companies. Over 200,000 companies use this database, and KBAs are being provided as that as to help guide where they should try and avoid. UN Biodiversity Lab, which guides governments in where they should be doing spatial planning, is also provided with the KBA data. DOPA, which the EU supports, is provided with KBA data. And KBA data is provided to the private sector through IBAT, which is an amalgamation of the KBA data, the protected areas data, and IUCN Red List, and it's packaged in a way in that database that's relevant to companies. At the last World Conservation Congress, there was a call, so now thinking about Target 1 and spatial planning, there was a resolution passed, which was unanimously passed by the governments who were present, and most NGOs who were present supported this motion, which was to call on governments to integrate KBAs in their national spatial planning and incorporate these into their MBSAPs. So that was very strongly supported. So I can give you an example of a country which has gone through a process of identifying KBAs across all of their taxonomic groups, in Mozambique. They started a process in 2018. They brought together their biodiversity experts in country, reached out to biodiversity experts outside the country, identified 29 KBAs where they had enough data, and those KBAs were incorporated in their national territorial plan. And KBAs are now also being used to guide where offsets for companies in the country can be placed. And they've subsequently raised additional funding, which is being used to identify, there were sites where they thought could be KBAs, but they didn't have enough data to prove it. So they're collecting data to be able to identify those sites. In Mozambique, as in many of the countries where we're working, we're encouraging the establishment of KBA national coordination groups that bring together government, the scientific community, such as herbarium universities, and also the conservation community. And those groups then together work on the identification of key biodiversity areas. And the advantage of doing it in that way is it has national ownership. Those KBAs then, it brings people together so they share their data, and the data then gets used and is pushed into national policy much more effectively. So some of the examples of some of the things that national coordination groups can lead to is increased data sharing by the experts. They work on a common goal and objectives of why they're collecting this biodiversity data and how they use it. They compile it at a country level. It encourages research on biodiversity across other different taxa, where often there's a focus on mammals and birds. That you identify key species and ecosystems to monitor at sites, so you understand at your KBA what are the key species you need to be conserving and what are the key ecosystems. You can also inform which sites need connectivity because you know the proportion of the population that occurs at a site and how much is there. So you can actually evaluate which sites need connecting and which don't. It helps repatriate biodiversity where there's museums outside the country that can bring it together. And it's a structure to help monitor and conserve those sites once the sites have been identified. So some examples, KBAs are being identified in Canada at the moment. Canada National Coordination Group establishes their own website and database, and they make their data available through that website as well. KBAs are being identified in Australia with BirdLife, a partner in Australia particularly. And similarly, Sambi in South Africa has their own web pages on KBAs. So finally, there's a couple of projects which we'll hear a lot more about in coming and next presentation particularly, but also the next few days. One is the Natura Connect project, which Martin's about to talk about. And another one is the GAP project, which is one of the Biodiversa funded projects. And as I mentioned before, KBAs are identified mainly for birds in Europe. So one of the goals of these two projects is to provide a more detailed scoping of where KBAs might be found across Europe. And then the GAP project will be actually working on forming KBA national coordination groups, refining where those KBAs are and hopefully proposing those KBAs and trying to integrate key biodiversity areas in a more broader systematic conservation planning process, which we'll hear about in a minute. So that's all I had to say. I'm welcome to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So questions or comments? All right. Yes, I have a question over there at the end. Question.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a really nice summary of where KBAs are. I wanted to sort of go back to the very beginning where you talked about protected areas and OECMs. And again, putting it in the context of 30 by 30. And as sort of a very general question, to what extent do we know what the distribution of KBAs are relative to existing protected areas, to existing IUCN 1 through 4 and existing OECMs of one kind or another? What is the pattern of overlap right now? What is the real challenge of the implementation of the KBAs?
So currently we're at about 43 to 44% coverage of KBAs by protected areas. That coverage, as you saw in some of those curves, has increased, but we've still got a long way to go before it. Ideally, we would have either most KBAs as OECMs or protected areas. One of the big concerns I have with OECMs is governments are going to be able to propose OECMs, and there's no vetting or anything about whether that OECM is an important. The guidance on OECM says they should be in areas of importance for biodiversity, but there's nothing to stop anyone. And when I was at the COP15, I heard people talk about city parks and set-asides for agriculture and things which clearly don't have any, or most will not have any global significance for biodiversity and won't halt extinction, which is what we're trying to achieve in Goal A.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? I have one from Magnus or from someone online. We don't know. You will tell us.
Yeah, the first one is by me. When you spoke about the funding and you said that the KBAs were to be avoided. I don't by involvement and activities and business and everything. That's not really what you mean, right?
The business and the banking and business one. Let me go back. The banks and biodiversity no-go policy has a policy where they want to push that KBAs should be completely avoided. In the guidance, I helped put some of the guidance together on that. We've pushed that it's not completely no-go, where there are developments that actually could benefit biodiversity, such as tourism developments in a KBA, then those can go ahead. Or if the intervention that the company wants to make has no negative impacts on the KBA trigger elements, so the ecosystems or species. with the IFC, it's critical habitat, so they have to be assessed under their critical habitat guidance. Doesn't say that you can't have any private sector engagement in a KBA, but they again should have no negative impacts on the elements that trigger KBA status.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because there are people living there. So another question from the chat. Why is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility not mentioned? The GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, is not mentioned. So there was a question on why is that?
So at the moment, we encourage people to use GBIF data when they're assessing identifying their KBAs, because it can help provide evidence that the species is present at a site. We're in the process of talking with GBIF about trying to more closely integrate GBIF data with the KBA data, both on the KBA website and on GBIF's website. So that will happen.
Okay, so we're going to stop here. So we stick to the timing. Thank you very much again, Andrew. Are you all awake? Do you want to stretch a little bit? Come on, stretch. Here comes Martin. Martin is from IASA, and Martin, you are supposed to talk about Natura Connect, but you had a great teasing from the previous speaker. So Martin.
Yes. Wait, let me figure out how I go here from.
Oh yeah, I'll put it back for you.
All right.
It's the big button there. This one.
This one. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
It will be.
Tick. All right. Yes, welcome everybody. So I'm the last talk before our little plenary and before the break. So obviously everybody is a bit rushing off into here. I have the pleasure of representing a Horizon Europe funded project called Natura Connect, which is all about designing this resilient and coherent trans-European conservation network for nature and people. To start you off, where are we today? We have a European conservation network that has a plethora of different sites, different categories that have been protected under various statuses. We are roughly at 25.7% of land and 11% of sea being protected. And depending on which areas you count or not, you will arrive at different percentages for each one of those. Obviously, at the same time, the European Union is also leading in the ambition to protect biodiversity better, and has proposed relatively ambitious biodiversity goals as well as targets towards contributing what is previously mentioned by previous speakers at the European Biodiversity Strategy. And for instance, here you can see some of the headline targets that are such as, for instance, legally protect 30% of the land, 30% of the sea, as well as 10% of strict protection. We also want to do more restoration in Europe, up to 20%, so that ecosystems are restored to good condition and species populations as well. And all of this, of course, also while facilitating ecological corridors, supporting sustainable land management, and also increasing the resilience with regards to climate mitigation and adaptation. And in Europe, of course, you might then want to ask, like, where do we actually do this? Where can we conserve and restore or sustainably manage and these sort of types of land? And we need to remember that many of these indicators or like percentage estimates here, they're a target, they're not the end goal. The goal is to stop or halt biodiversity decline. But how we get there is obviously various of different approaches. And in Europe, we need to focus on what is of biodiversity significance, for instance, at the bioregional level within Europe, as well as, for instance, at the European member state level. What we trying to establish in our project is the notion of a trans-European nature network, or 10N. That is essentially a network that builds on the existing Natura 2000 sites and other sites of relevant biodiversity relevance, and is coherent, resilient, and connected. We're following in our project guidelines that essentially can be broadly summarized under the CARE principles: comprehensive, adequate, resilient, and effective. And I'm going to go you now step by step to what the specific aspects of these principles are and how we're going to address that in our project. And since all of you are working on Biodiversity Protect project, I think much of this you can also relate to in your projects as well. Comprehensive, what do we mean by this? We know that a majority of countries within Europe actually struggle with incomplete biodiversity information. Over 6% of the countries in Europe have not enough sufficient data in the Article 17 and Article 12 reporting. Many of them are outdated, or often many of the species that should be protected are not really well known where they occur and in what numbers. And there's also a lack of monitoring data and raw data available for many of the biodiversity efforts that we want to facilitate in Europe. What we are going to do in Nature Connect is we working in collaboration with EuropaBon, which was previously mentioned, also with the KBA partnership, of course, and as well also with the new European Biodiversity Topic Center, which to facilitate the integration of available data, produce reliable indicators at national and European level that provide you with estimates of where currently species, ecosystems, and ecosystem services are and where they will be in the future. And all of these data will be provided openly for every European member state and Europe as a whole. Also, when we're thinking about adequacy, our next criteria, we need to think about what we actually want to conserve. Traditionally, protected areas have been known as protecting endangered species and threatened and other forms of biodiversity. But at the same time, they fulfill, particularly in Europe, a variety of functions. There are cultural heritages and heritage agricultural sites. There's specific regulating and provisioning functions in terms of ecosystem services. And all of these functions and values towards particular aspects of protection need to be incorporated somehow in our 10N. Otherwise, we lose the trust of many stakeholders and we lose the trust of the people who live on these lands at the moment, because that is what they value in terms of the protection. We also know from existing reports that the coverage of many of the species listed in Annex 1 and Annex 2 of the European directives are relatively broad. So we see that they're covering across the board. But of course, when you see those numbers, you don't really know, okay, we're covering a certain number of plants, we know a certain number of mammals, but is it enough? Does it actually halt the decline of biodiversity? What we're going to do is we are going to addressing this adequacy challenge to the concept of favorable reference values, or in other words, how much do we actually need of a certain thing to protect or conserve? This can be broadly defined as a range within the significant ecological variation of a habitat or species within a given geographical region, so that its long-term survival is ensured. And using this concept, we can then directly plan how much would be enough, what areas would count, and where's the sufficiency of certain areas towards these targets. We also need to address of the European protection network that many of the sites that are currently there are actually not adequate at all. We have over 67% of all the Natura 2000 sites are smaller than 10 square kilometers. And a majority of them actually up to 40% are literally only, or 35% are actually smaller than 1 square kilometer. We can really weigh, okay, what is the value in terms of these individual sites? And we need to investigate how do they contribute to the entire network across states, across biogeographic regions, and within Europe, because smaller sites don't necessarily contribute towards the effective protection further. And this is also complemented, of course, with a high level of fragmentation within and outside of protected areas of many of these sites. In our project, we're going to apply a systematic conservation planning approach, which is also mentioned in the GBF as inclusive integrated planning, where we're essentially taking different value systems, different data sets, as well as different constraints of where you can plan for certain aspects of protection, restoration, or also strict protection. And this will critically also include different scenarios of what people value and also how the 10N might look like in the future, for instance, towards certain future trends or changes. This, in regard, is also a critical aspect that is often forgotten. Many of the protected area networks that are currently existing and that will be established, hopefully, in the next couple of years are suffering tremendous change in this century. We know from IPCC that the conditions that currently exist in protected areas will dramatically change during this century. And if we want to make these protected areas resilient, we need to design them in a way that they actually can account for these changes, that there's flow and connectivity between them in the future. And this not only incorporates climate change, but it of course also incorporates land use change. The European landscapes are constantly changing, often to internal, but also external pressures, market forces on socioeconomic trends. We know now increasing intensification of agriculture, for instance, towards the war in Ukraine. So essentially, we need to incorporate some of these aspects also in the planning of the protected area networks to see like, okay, what are plausible futures of where protected areas could be and how we can best be situated. We will do this in our project to future-proof planning that takes these various future trends into account, directly identify, for instance, important climate refugia, stepping stones, or areas where in the future there's a very high bet that these areas might also in the future suitable for the greatest number of species, as well as ecological functions that they could provide, so that protected areas are resilient towards future changes and can protect now and in the future our biodiversity that we so value. Some people might argue actually that the 30% in Europe isn't really the problem. The problem is often the 70%. What is the rest of the land that we are surrounding it? And the role of GBI or green and blue infrastructure, so everything that we not protect, some previous speakers have mentioned also EOCMs, and the European legislation is often as green infrastructure and things that facilitate within cities and between. We need to clarify the role of this in the matrix, how it connects to protected areas and how it can facilitate our nature recovery in this estimate approach. And in our project, we're placing particular efforts towards connectivity between those sites. We're using, for instance, the concept of green infrastructure to estimate the structural connectivity between current and future protected sites, such as here, for instance, shown in the example of Spain, where the woodlands is used as an indicator, okay, where is the structural connectivity towards critical nodes of the protected area network. And we will expand on this work across Europe, also using mode of structural integrity between the sites as well as functional, so that we can rely, for instance, that current protected sites as well as sites that will be in the future designated have sufficient gene flow between them, and there's also sufficient corridors between them. And some of these things obviously require also a restoration of land outside of protected areas that might then be turned so to enable these certain features. Lastly, I also want to mention that a protected area network needs to be effective. When we talk about effectiveness, what we mean mostly to that is money, as simply as that. Managing protected area network in Europe costs a lot of resources, financial resources. The Prioritization Action Framework for the European Union estimates that roughly 10.1 billion per year is spent on the Natura 2000 networks and accompanying sites. And as you can see, although there is a substantial fraction of that one-off costs, much of it is also annual repetitive costs that goes into maintenance, green infrastructure measures, as well as administrative measures for these protected areas. And what we will do in our project, we will try to review the most comprehensive state of what are public-private financing opportunities within Europe, so that, for instance, protected areas can, in the future, being adequately resourced, can facilitate uptakes from different donors for different funds, so that, for instance, much of the management effectiveness that in the end comes down to also how they're managed, how many people they're employed with, that protected area managers have a concrete decision tree and guidelines what they could do in which area and what are the available resources to them. And we're working very closely with other EU institutions towards this. So to summarize, Natura Connect will provide a series of key outputs. We will create spatial priorities for national, international designations, such as for the KBAs, but also directly related to the biodiversity strategy in Europe, which effectively means we will identify, for instance, those areas which are the best bet areas for 10% strict protection. We will areas that have high potential for restoration in Europe and where and what is being restored, and the 30% of where we can fill up to these 30% areas. We can use this information to evaluate the national pledges that many of the European member states are making, such as, for instance, to NADEC, where repeatedly being evaluated, okay, which country is pledging how much in covering the existing protection gaps. And we will particularly ensure that this trans-European nature network will be coherent in terms of the corridors, but also across country borders. Then despite protected area designation being a responsibility of the member states, often when we talk about effective protection, we need to look beyond member states. We need to look at what species and habitats require. We will also provide capacity building. Much of the data that we are creating, as I said before, will be made openly available, and we will also create new tools and platforms that essentially allow people to identify on their own sites with their own data, for example, how to design certain biodiversity areas, how to design, for instance, corridors, and do that at the various scales. Natura Connect is a trans-European project, but we also have several case studies at different ranges, from very local scale and individual cities to regions and Donana, but also to entire countries such as France or Finland, for which we are deeply engaging with stakeholders and national policymakers in those areas to see like how their individual national action plans or regional action plans can fit into these 10N at the European scale. And we will also, of course, make further proposals what follows after this project. So how can the results of it being uptaken in terms of evaluating the performance of this 10N network also by individual sites? So what is the sufficiency of individual protected areas and future sites to be established? So, and that it is from me. I thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, you can put them to me, but also to my colleague Piero Visconti, who will be speaking tomorrow. And yeah. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin. Margareta. So we have some time for questions or comments. Anybody in the room? No ladies has taken the floor. So ladies, wake up. We want female questions now. Anybody in the, yes, here's a woman.
Thank you. Many thanks for this very, very nice presentation. My question was actually related to how Biodiversa could relate to Natura Connect. How do you see that? What could we how could we be complementary in the actions that we support?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think many of since we're Biodiversa Protect, and many of the projects that are funded to biodiversity and Biodiversa in this round are dealing particularly with protection and of biodiversity in various efforts. And our project is particularly looking at the trans-European scale. We are looking particularly at what can be, for instance, to national reporting at, for instance, the scale, for instance, at different countries, European member states, but also the European Union. What we don't really often cover well, and this is something I think in the conservation planning world and the identification of expansion of the networks, is this what I would call the cross-scale issue. So essentially, how do we actually link from a regional scale to a national scale to a local scale? And how we do that consistently across different projects and different processes. And I mean, I'm here in the capacity not only on Natura Connect, but also of a Biodiversa funded project in this. So, and I'm very excited also to learn about the other Biodiversa funded projects to see where there's actually, for instance, synergies between the processes of how biodiversity is protected in these various studies and how we do it in at a trans-European scale. And maybe there are, for instance, possible collaborations, possible sort of overlaps in terms of how we can learn from each other also in terms of the process and so forth.
Other questions? Yes,
Yeah.
we have to. Then after, ladies first, and then you after.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I'm working for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and we're working in the field mostly outside of Europe, mostly in developing countries. And I just wondered if there was any lessons learned from the work you've done so far that could apply to other areas of the world, because obviously Europe is quite a specific context. There's maybe less ecological integrity than other areas. It's very highly managed, but that's obviously different in other regions. But I'm interested if you had any reflections of how this could apply elsewhere. Thanks.
Yeah. So our project has only started last year. So obviously we are not yet at the stage where we can provide like conclusive evidence and so forth. But I would say that first of all, we will provide a lot of tools and new guidance and so forth documents. So for instance, we're planning our ambition, and also my personal ambition is we want to really bring these sort of concepts, for instance, of systematic planning, identification of best available sites and different standards. We want to bring them to as wide as possible in the communities. And we want to do it in a way that these standards of identifying these sites are robust as possible. And in my opinion, many of the ways how we identify it in Europe can be, of course, applied to other regions as well. But nevertheless, I also need to say that much of this is also needs to be designed very much in mind with who you're addressing with, right? So basically, to not have it a too top-down process. You need to engage with the stakeholders in other regions. You need to find out what they actually want and what the specific aspects of those new protected areas or strategies are. Like, for instance, in our project, we're doing the two range of stakeholder engagement workshops. The next one is actually in 2 weeks. So it's essentially, we really need to also get at the core of the issue. How is their particularity situation maybe should have a different process than what it is in Europe. Lastly, we're doing a little bit also outside of Europe. So, I mean, I didn't really touch much about the scale, but our project focused on the European Union, but also the European continent as a whole. So we're, for instance, including the UK in it, but we're also including, for instance, many of the Balkan countries. We're including like neighboring states as well. And we also have some plans, not yet realized, but we also have plans to include, for instance, the OCTs. And that. So essentially, we're trying to incorporate some of this in the process also further. And of course, as Andy also previously mentioned, we are collaborating together with the KBA Secretariat, which brings into our project is, of course, also the expertise of the global significance of many of these sites as well, where this is also connected to.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you, Martin. That was great. I was very intrigued by how you have so many different land uses, so many different scales, and many of these areas are very small. And this is sort of a scientific question, sort of following up on Hildy's question. How do you define aggregation and connectivity through all these different scales, land uses, differences in different species and their transferability? How do you get on top of single measures of that kind of aggregation and scale?
And you have 1 minute, not even 1 minute to answer that one. Good luck.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I mean, I guess most of us haven't really figured out how to do it well. In our project, we're doing it through, as I said before, through a series of case studies where we're, for instance, having implementations at a local scale, national scale, up to like a more bioregional scale and the European scale. And it is a major challenge also for us, our project, to find out how we can align these different planning across scales so that, for instance, certain priorities at different scales align perfectly across them. And yeah, much of this will be a harmonization of data, but also harmonization of methods, harmonization of systems, definitions, what counts, what does count not. And I think much of the disparity that we had in the past, they also come from these processes. So people having, for instance, very different understanding of what green infrastructure means. I mean, anything from an unprotected forest to a park in an urban city. So it's yeah, definitely a challenge on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin, again. And he lied to you. He said there would be coffee break after his talk. There's still one panel before coffee break, so liar. Okay, next is a panel. The panel is, you are still on the panel, so you can stay. The panel is about discussing national experiences. Okay, so we have the pleasure of having Florent Merle. Can you please all join us to the panel? Karel Chobot, Milena Matakovic, and Martin, whom you just met. So Florent is from the French Biodiversity Agency. Karel is from the Nature Conservation Agency of the Czech Republic. And Milena is from the Environmental Protection Agency of Montenegro. Welcome, all of you. So this is how things are going to happen. All the three panel members from member states or future member states will have 5 minutes each, and they've been asked 2 questions. They've been asked, what national actions are ongoing to widen and strengthen connectivity of protected areas. That was the first question. And the second question they were asked is, what are the challenges, barriers, uncertainties you face at national levels, but also would you like to highlight some successes at national level? And we want to hear about successes too. So they will each speak for 5 minutes, and then Martin will come in and say how maybe Natura Connect can help. And then we'll have some questions and answers again. So ladies, get ready with questions. Okay, so the first speaker will be Florent, if that's okay for you.
Yep, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Florent Merle, and I'm glad to be present here to represent my organization, the French Biodiversity Agency. As I am part of the International Directorate, I will represent the voice of colleagues in charge of this project. French Biodiversity Agency has been involved since the beginning of Biodiversa partnership. Roughly 20 experts are working within the agency. So I would like to explain first what is the role of my organization into the ecosystem of stakeholders involved in France to implement conservation, protection, and restoration of biodiversity. So the French Biodiversity Agency is a new public body running under the umbrella of 2 ministries. First, the ministry in charge of agriculture, and then the ministry in charge of environment, gathering 5 former agencies in charge of biodiversity to be in line with the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So we have 5 main tasks. First is to support implementation of environmental policies, like the French strategy for biodiversity or European directives. We also develop knowledge and research on habitat and species with collection and data management and EU reports. We then enforce the management of protected areas, and we are also in charge of law enforcement on the ground, and we support other protected area managers through resources centers. I will speak later about that. And finally, we try to mobilize civil society from citizens to local authorities, companies, NGO to mainstream biodiversity. Once I say that, I would like to address shortly what is at state, what is the state of play for biodiversity in France. So as you know, France is a very diverse country. Thanks to our overseas territories, we host roughly 10% of world-known species. We are also located on 5 global biodiversity hotspots, and we have identified yet 20,000 key areas for biodiversity. Like others, we are currently facing a continuing decline in biodiversity, with an huge increase in degradation in Atlantic, Mediterranean, and continental ecoregions, a significant loss of wetlands, alarming reports on freshwater and coastal ecosystems. And in terms of species, we observe that common birds decline faster than rarer species, which is really worrying. Therefore, at political level, the state of play underlines an imbalance between means and pressures. For example, the Natura 2000 report shows that protected areas are important for key species and habitats, and efficient for some kinds of pressures like urbanization or disturbance, but less for other like eutrophication. So there is a crucial necessity to adopt a larger approach to tackle pressures more efficiently. And we have 2 ways to implement this issue of nature connectivity in France. First, it's a national strategy for protected areas. According to this strategy, all protected areas and their connectivity should have been taken Oh, sorry. I will do my best. Should have been taken into account into strategical planning document by 2022, and we are working on that. But I will go straight to the second point, which is the more relevant here. And since 2010, 10, we have launched a new initiative, not only for protected area, but for all kinds of biodiversity networks. We call it the Green and Blue Infrastructure Network Policy. With this strategy, we want first to connect biodiversity reservoir with ecological corridors, and then to connect all biodiversity aspects within all regions. To implement this strategy, all policy scales are mobilized. We have general orientation at the national level, and then we have the so-called regional scheme of ecological coherence, which allows the integration of green and blue infrastructure in local policies, especially in urban planning document, because it's key. As you know, it aims to tackle a real change within the way we use the land, and we reuse the land, because municipality has an exclusive prerogative regarding use of land. In order to have a successful policy, we need to make sure that the tools, guidance, and technical support can be produced, reach the right stakeholders. That's why at the French Biodiversity Agency, we are leading a resource center on green and blue infrastructures. This coordination role allows us to go deeper in the definition of green and blue infrastructure, and we are currently working on other components such as brown infrastructures for soils, white infrastructures for noises, dark infrastructures regarding light pollutions, which is also a really serious disturbance to the species. We publish a dedicated guide which I would be happy to share with you afterwards. Thank you.
And for our colleagues online, you don't realize, but we have two very tough ladies on the front row that are waving when they go overtime. Our next speaker is actually our host here in the Czech Republic, Karel. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, everyone. I have an opportunity to represent my organization, which is actually the Nature Conservation Agency of the Czech Republic, which is the very important public body dealing with, at one side, with the nature conservation in practice, and on the other side is a technical institute dealing with, for example, with the biodiversity data. When I want to stress especially successes in the scope of the protected areas connectivity, which was the topic of this panel, it's hard to, we have to bear in mind that the definition of the connectivity in protected areas is a little bit complex and vague. When we are talking about the protected areas, we mostly think about the protected areas as IUCN category, strictly protected areas, nature reserves, and national parks, and so on. In this chapter or in this area, the connectivity is hardly to be achieved if you are thinking about the physical links or linkages. We can sometimes go to the connectivity in this among these areas via stepping stones and so on. So that's accessible, but the physical links are nearly impossible. But we in Czech Republic, which should be stressed as a success, we have a parallel system of protected areas, which are the areas which are protected for the spatial planning. So we have the ecological network, which is called the System of Ecological Stability, a little bit old-fashioned name, but actually built on the tradition of building ecological networks. And this system is implemented and working. And the challenge, if I want to push up some challenging issue, is to somehow use this existing system of actual physical links among the protected areas in the scope of spatial planning, also for the connectivity among the protected areas from the nature conservation perspective. And this is actually possible, but it's needs a paradigm shift or a changing of the thinking about in these areas, but actually it's possible. When I could stress another success is quite good data quality and big data quantity in the Czech Republic. Czechia is a country with a long and huge tradition of biological research. We have our national biodiversity portal, which is functioning, and it's very implemented in the nature conservation practice. So all the nature conservation authorities use the data about species and habitat diversity, which we are promoting. And that's also used for these building of these conservation areas networks. So that's all from me. I think all the points are important and we'll have
Thank you, Karel, and thank you for all those highlighting the successes. Now, Milena from the Montenegro, please.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody from my side. And I would also like to stress that it is my great pleasure to be here and to participate at this panel. I'm representing Environmental Protection Agency of Montenegro, who is a public institution having a lot of responsibilities when it comes to nature protection, especially when in the process of establishing, developing the expert studies, but also in the process of gathering of the data and proposing the future ecological network, which would be one day Natura 2000, since we are now in the process of EU association. So I would also like to, let's say, stress that our national protected area network is now about 14% of the whole territory of the country when it comes to terrestrial part, and we have 3 marine protected areas, and we have in this network is almost 80 areas, what is a lot. The biggest areas are national parks and park of nature, and the main challenge when we speak about connectivity of those areas, although some of them are physically connected, is different management approaches, especially if they are proclaimed in different categories. For example, we have concrete example of one area which is national park and the other area which is park of nature. So, and even when it comes to the, let's say, natural values, this area that is park of nature could be also national park, but it was very hard to achieve from the point of view of the agreement of local communities that didn't want it centralized level of management. So one of the challenges is sometimes to, let's say, have within these bordering areas same management approaches, what is of course equal to challenges to ensure effective and adequate management approaches. I agree that the connectivity is going beyond the actually protected areas, official protected areas, and in order to achieve the connectivity, we have to think about establishing of efficient corridors. And in our case, we had the corridors within special plan from 2008, but without clear objectives and measures. So barrier and let's say my message would be that we need definitely innovative management approaches when it comes to corridors and connectivity, meaning to determine very clear objectives and to determine measures, and maybe innovative management approaches, meaning to involve all sectors and to involve these measures in any part of the important documents like special plans. My colleague from Czech Republic mentioned it, and as a basis to really implement and ensure that this connectivity could be efficient. When it comes to Montenegro, I also would like to share with you that success is that we are in the process of establishing COGOF ecological network, and we in this regard wanted also to have very good databases. So we are doing from 2016 very detailed field researches on the distribution of habitat and species according to the Natura 2000 methodologies, but actually like we are doing catastrophe of distribution of habitat and species. Reason why we choose this approach, which is very similar to Czech experience, is that previously we had, let's say, big challenges and problems with really data on biodiversity in GIS format. We all know some stories about distribution of habitat and species, but not really when it comes to decision making, spatial plans, and so on. Where are they? So we took this opportunity of establishment of ecological network to really straighten our databases, and we are now about on 50% of the territory covered by these detailed field researches, and this is going to continue in upcoming period. So my, let's say, last message would be that we really need good databases as well to be precise with this, what I already mentioned, defining the clear objectives of the not just protected areas, but also corridors, and measures that are then could be further communicated with different sectors, with the government, and also maybe even to think to introduce in our legal framework some more obligatory articles on management of these corridors on innovative way. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. Martin, How does a trans-European network help here?
Yeah, it's gonna help all of you. It's a very interesting challenges, of course, and lots of them very particular to many European member states, which all have their own implementation guidelines, their own management plans, and their own often historical ways where how planning is being conducted. And it usually, of course, in future efforts need to build on those. It doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. We need to incorporate what we have into existing networks. In general, how can Natura Connect help? I think we can provide assistance and also support in 3 different areas, in my opinion. This is one area is, for instance, in data. I was hearing, for instance, that some of the databases being collected are already quite complete, very good monitoring projects ongoing. In other areas, there might be still some gaps or some support, particularly with GIS data. As I mentioned before, we are working a lot with some of the European Biodiversity Topic Center, major data providers within Europe to harmonize much of this biodiversity information and also make it available in an open form. And we are trying to do this, of course, not only for European states, but also for the European continent as a whole. So that's, for instance, also for European accession states as such. Another big challenge that I heard, which I think is also particularly mentioned in the GBF, is the incorporation of other forms of land management. So if we are thinking, for instance, we heard of brown or black infrastructure and so forth. We heard of particular planning frameworks that are looking not necessarily on the biodiversity side, but also very much incorporating the connectivity aspect and the corridor aspect. And what we are trying to achieve in Natura Connect, we're trying to follow much closely in what also the GBF formulated in terms of protected area planning, which what we say is integrated planning. That means we don't necessarily plan only for biodiversity. We plan for a number of different services and ranges. We're trying to identify, for instance, areas that have also high biodiversity value, but also areas that, for instance, are necessary in terms of provisioning values or that are necessary to just for certain land management forms. For instance, one of the aspects that we're particularly trying to focus on is there may be opportunities for restoration to establish such corridors in areas, and where could those be? So we could hear, for instance, certain corridors that are not yet there, or certain connectivity that is yet to established, but how could we get there? Are we stuck with the situation where we couldn't change the affecting land system, need to work around it? Or can we flag out the opportunities where such things could happen? And I think a large part where our project can also assist there is these transboundary aspects, of course, because while much of the planning is often done at a very local scale. I mean, we're talking often on the urban planning regulations where much of the protected areas also established and neighboring sites. But at the end of the day, the species or habitats that are meant to conserve, they need to be evaluated at a larger scale. So many of the sites, if they are seen as in isolation, then obviously they would not contribute to the existing performance of the species as a whole. And I think this is also where we could, for instance, provide to all the member states, in fact, and all the neighboring regions, robust criteria for evaluation of national sites, such as, for instance, if Montenegro or France or the Czech Republic identifies opportunities to expand the existing sites towards the 2030, we could provide guidance, essentially, how can we evaluate the sufficiency of these new sites in terms of, for instance, the national states, which you might obviously much better be placed, but also in terms of the international and regional stage. So, for instance, this particular area, what would be the sufficiency of protecting that in terms of the conservation status of a species at the European level? And this is something I think where our project is in a unique role, because we can really look at the entirety of Europe and are connected to many of the different initiatives that also can support this sort of robust information. And
particularly also for France, it's a bit easier for us because we have, for instance, French case studies where one of our partners, University of Lausanne, actually leads on the national planning for much of the protected areas in France. So that would be, for instance, also a very good case study to see like how we can match that also within the European scale and there. Last but not least, and this is the final aspect, one last word, I think, and this is the capacity building. I think we can provide a lot of guidance how to use the tools and the data that we can generate. And much of this we really hope is being uptaken across different scales, also by the areas which are not direct case study regions, for instance, in our projects. So this is something that we could definitely offer for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I'd like to open the floor for discussions or comments, or you can even share experiences from your member states. There is one here, the lady here in green, and then the gentleman behind.
Thank you very much. My name is Lika Georgadze. I'm representing the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Agriculture of Georgia. Thank you very much for these interesting discussions. I would ask a question regarding the widening of protected areas. Briefly, I would speak about Georgia's case. Like you may know that we are one of the 34 hotspots in biodiversity interest, and also we have different types of protected areas. We have all IUCN category protected areas. We have wetlands, we have marine protected areas, emerald network, and etc. So our areas of specific conservational concern is quite wide. And of course, we are continuing annually, we are trying to widen these protected areas in our country, just to submit to this GBF targets also. But on another hand, we are also the country of transitional economy, and as a we also last year submitted the new application for EU membership, and so we are aware quite well about these requirements and challenges. But my question would be from the little bit different perspective of this protected areas widening process. So we are trying to widen these protected areas, but on another hand, we have economical developments in our country also, which these economical development projects foreseen these protected areas and all kind of protection as an obstacle for these developments. And so we have this struggle every time when we speak about this new protection of specific areas. And in Georgia's case, as a small country and a mountain country, we don't have like big opportunities to change so much. So my question is how these countries with more or less same experience deal with this like challenge. I'm pretty sure that almost all countries have this challenge with economical development. So how we can continue our conservational targets and conservational like goals, and also not to cross these economical developments and make the additional restrictions for them. Thank you very much.
Who will take the answer to the $1 million question? You want to start, Martin? Then you can
make a very brief start of how we're trying to do in Nature Connect, which is we're relying, as I mentioned earlier, also on a scenario perspective. So we are trying to map out certain pathways of how, for instance, landscapes might change in the future. And these pathways, in the form they are mapped out, they are part of a modeling framework that also considers, for instance, different socioeconomic factors, such as, for instance, changes in economic revenues of trade, of essentially labor forces that shape landscapes in the future. And by doing so, we can actually identify where there might be opportunities to identify, for instance, a future protected area while not compromising existing food supply, for instance, towards agricultural land, because there are certain agricultural regions that are important to keep. And in my opinion, or at least that's a bit from our project, is that we really need to need to have some sort of a goal-seeking point. So basically, can we actually can we still make it with the 30 by 30 targets while still not sacrificing this economic development? This is not only relevant for Georgia, it's also for many European states, which are now in states of recession, of course, many of them, and they need to think like, okay, should things be scrapped entirely, or is there a way we can still get to a nature and people positive future? And yeah, we're trying to evaluate that, but there are many answers to that road, I guess also.
Anybody else on the panel want to come on this one?
I can share maybe some experience also from the transitional economy. Also, because Czechia is still an example of it. It's still a question of priorities and specific conditions on the spot. So some economic development can be somehow compromised with the protection, actually. For example, the food production, if you are stressing the quality of the food products, that can be somehow possible even in protected areas of lower level. But if you are thinking about the strict protection, that's a question of priorities and question of politicians. What are the priorities on the spot? To have a, for example, very strict reserve or national park, or some destroyed area which will give us only a very in time limited services, or some sustainable development possible. So that's a question of politics, for example, or I think mainly.
I would like just to add that Montenegro is in similar situation like you explained, so there is no some solution since I'm coming from let's say agency that are dealing with licenses as well. We are trying through this procedure really to explain importance of protected to let's say not to load every project that is really economy department or tourist department or whoever it is trying to implement and to convince the government that priority should be also nature protection. We have few good examples, but many other that are not, let's say, so good cases of this. So it is going very hardly, and I don't have any, how to say, solution to propose to that, except, as I said before, really to convince also in some dialogue or even legal framework, other departments via spatial plans and so on, to really integrate if not full protection in some strict areas, as a colleague mentioned from Czech Republic, then some measures that can ensure this connectivity of protected areas, and then that can also, let's say, contribute to protection of species and habitats.
Not to mention that we also want to re-industrialize Europe. We had a question there. I think, where are the microphones? They're lost. And then there, sorry, Andrew. I think I said, I saw that gentleman first, so you go after. Okay, so you can go first, Andrew.
Okay. In the negotiations for the COP, no one was really ever talked about it has to be 30% for every country, but most countries are interpreting it that way. With a grouping of countries like the EU, potentially you don't have to think about 30% of every country, and where the case like Georgia was particularly rich, then perhaps you can think about more protection there, less protection somewhere else. Is that thinking actually happening in the EU at the moment?
Martin?
I would directly answer, because there's a really fascinating questions that we also have to answer in our project, is the question of equity. Because within Europe, biodiversity, as most of you will probably know, is not, so species and habitats are not equally distributed. The Mediterranean regions have considerably higher number of species, number of threatened habitats, and therefore, if you would really focus on protecting only those vulnerable sites, then obviously we would need a lot more area as a whole in southern parts of Europe. So, and naturally, many of these targets, how much should be protected, in our opinion, they should be guided by the outcome towards the goal, essentially. We want to reverse biodiversity decline, and protection is only a measure towards that. Sometimes the amount of area is not really what matters, but how it's being managed. And one strict protected area might, in some cases, for certain species, which are particularly threat sensitive, be more valuable than many smaller sites which have potentially also some looser management or other forms of use in there. And yeah, lastly, I can say that in terms of the designation of the area, we work together with the many people from NADEC and trying to get the pledges of the individual member states. And it is up to individual member states of how much area they put forward, like whether it's 30%, or I already heard from some member states, for instance, they don't even want to put a number on the strict protection target. So they just say we strictly protect as much as we can, but they don't put a number on that. So we can already see there's some nuances within Europe of how this is being realized in the end.
Anybody else on the panel wants to react to that? Or we go to the next question? Next question.
Just to note that there is an IUCN guidance document on building conservation networks with ecological corridors, and it specifies a number of criteria for what makes a corridor, which I think would fit all your different examples, because we're talking about diversity here from farmland management to whole intact ecosystems acting as corridors. But there is a database established for it under WCMC's Protected Planet database. We're really looking to populate that database. So if you're developing corridors and they can meet these criteria, including how is it being governed, please report them to this new emerging database so the world can understand them and map them and learn from them.
Okay, yes, please. And then there will be another one over there. And then another one over there.
Thank you. I'm Ana Lilaba from University of Aveiro in Portugal. And thank you for your introductions and for this very nice discussion. When we are talking about management, managing, and there is also communication, and you also mentioned this, and you mentioned different spatial scales. Could language be a challenge? Because we are all discussing in English, but if you involve local population, you also have we all have transboundary challenges. How do you see and how do you intend to communicate at the different scales?
So who's answering that one? Sorry, I was planning. Martin again. Laurent, you have to wake up.
I mean, our project focusing particularly on the 10N, where we is across Europe, and I mean, in official European language, English, French, we have many people in our consortium who can speak this, and we try to make the available as much as possible the information that we provide in these languages. When we talk particularly to these different scales where this implementation happens, and this is, for instance, the reason also why in our project we have case studies where we actually test out our framework at different scales. And there, of course, we need to engage with the stakeholders in the regions, and this has to be done in a form and in a particular framing that they understand and that they are familiar with. Like, we can't come from the European level and essentially from top down and say, well, this is particular the area that needs to be conserved or so forth. This always has to be coming from several different angles. And in my opinion, this is the biggest challenge that we face, not only for our project, but also for, I guess, all the projects here in this room that are funded to Biodiversity Protect. How are we resolving this scale issue? How are we meeting sites that are locally implementable, but at the same time also of global significance? Because we need to meet somewhere in the middle. It doesn't, if we want to really ensure that these areas fulfill their functions well.
Thank you. Another question over there.
Yeah. So I'm Julia Leventon from the Global Change Research Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences. We've already touched on a little bit that sometimes expanding protected areas can be a bit contentious, weighing up against other goals. And we've also talked about engagement with stakeholders. And I'd like to scale that down to the more local level and ask about how our respondents are engaging with citizens in the areas that protected areas are expanding into or that are affected by that expansion of protected areas. So how are you engaging with citizens to address some of these trade-offs and tensions that might be there?
Thank you for the question. It would be nice to have an input from each and every one of you. So Florent, you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I can try to respond in it with a link with your question. Maybe just to present an initiative we have at the French Biodiversity Agency at the national level. We are trying to set up establishment of assessment within local territories, local municipalities, with a program called Atlas de la biodiversité communale. It's a biodiversity communal assessment involving all people around biodiversity, I mean everyone around this assessment within the local authority, like businesses, farmers, scholars, and maybe urbanists and landowners and NGOs, to do first a global assessment of the local of the community of the local territory, and therefore trying to set up a new urban regulation to take into account the result of this assessment. So that's why we are trying to do, and we establish this program for the local authorities, which wanted to go into, and we found it also.
Can you see it online, the atlas?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so maybe you can get the address. Carl, please.
Yeah, the involvement of the general public or local public is a key issue, actually, especially in the case of the large-scale protected areas. It's a very hard issue also. If you are preparing and establishing the small-scale protected areas, it's quite simple because you have a very small number of stakeholders, especially the landowners, which are somehow have to agree with the management and so on, and the level of protection. But actually, we are actually in a situation of preparing of several large-scale protected areas, even a new national park, and the discussions and the communication with the local authorities and general public is a very hard issue, and it's impossible to do something without them. So it's hard, but we try to.
Milena. The Montenegro recipe for public involvement.
I agree that it's very challenging, and in Montenegrin case, we have this, let's say, practice to involve the local community and the stakeholders in the planning process of the development of the, let's say, expert studies in the process of proclamation of these areas, and reactions are different based on the, let's say, mostly restrictions that is going to be introduced by the proclamation of the areas. We had, let's say, different cases of let's say, how to say, reactions of the local communities, from very cooperative one, then to really, how to say, that in some cases they see this as a big obstacles, but then in some cases these, let's say, issues are not easy to be solved, and it is going even after proclamation, involving them in the management actually, and providing them information what could be their benefits, and let's say even how they can, let's say, change maybe behavior in these particular areas, and not to have not to be impacted by these, let's say, new measures and restrictions. And in particular cases of marine protected areas, we had good examples that fishermen in these areas first didn't want in these areas, but then we had a project that supported their capacity building, even study tours in some other protected areas. They had their opportunity to speak with the fishermen in this area. And then after they accepted this, even they now participate actively in the management. This, what I mentioned now, is ideal case. It's not always like that, but the main point is that it is very important to start this communication with the local community from the beginning, and to share honestly with them information on which measures you are going to introduce, and also what they can do differently maybe in order to support the protected areas, what would be their benefit, what wouldn't be. So this is the way how to proceed. As I said at the end of the story, it's not easy. It's not something that will go like on an easy way in most of the cases, but can contribute at the end to more efficient approaches and management solutions.
Thank you. So Volker, you'll have the last question, but before we have to let the people online speak.
Yeah, so we have several questions. I'll combine them into one. I'll try to.
Get ready.
The question is, expanding protected areas will in many places be competing with other land uses, sustainable energy, solar panels, wind, and so on. So how will it compromise meeting the targets of 30% and 10%? And related to this, what about the quality of the existing protected areas, and not only the area itself, but what's in it? And related to this also is the dimension of within population diversity and the genetic dimension. So that's a combination of those.
Who wants to answer one of the three questions?
I will try to start, because it's a very challenging issue, which you have mentioned. The assessment of the quality or the assessment of the effectiveness of the protected areas is very hard topic, actually. Now we are trying to go through it in the scope of one of our integrated life project, which is developing the complete management cycle, involving also the assessment of the phenomena protected by the site. And it's very hard because the number of phenomena, species and habitats are very high. Every species and every habitat needs to have its own methodology, and it has to be practically implemented. We have to find the resources to search for the data, search with specialists, and it's really challenging. Hopefully we will go through. Yeah. So we know about the problem and trying to somehow face it.
So we need to share the successes there. Anybody else on one of these three questions, Martin?
Yeah, I can combine them a little bit and making a link to what I also previously mentioned in terms of constructing essentially plausible pathways of how landscapes can develop. There was mentioned, for instance, displacement effects, which is something we, for instance, in Natura Connect, we directly evaluate. We are constructing, for instance, protected area networks in certain areas according to a specific socioeconomic pathway, according to the Nature Futures framework, and then see how, for instance, the placement of these protected areas, what kind of land uses they would displace, and what the consequences for other areas in Europe would be. And often that can, for instance, have unintentional consequences for existing corridors. If, for instance, the production of land, like certain crop types, need to be shifted from some areas to another simply because it was decided this area should be managed differently now. So this is definitely something that we evaluate. The other bit that I also want to stress in terms of effectiveness and so on, I think this was not really mentioned so far. We're talking about the 30%, but there's of course also the other bits of the European biodiversity strategy, which is the 20%, the 20% restoration. And the current guidance, for instance, that we have received mentioned from the European Union is often this sort of restoration is not an additionality to much of the 30%, but is also primarily seen as complementarity. So, for instance, many of the protected areas in Europe that we have are often comprised of several different land use types, which are within them. For instance, we have national parks which have intensively cultivated land within the national park area. These areas still exist within Europe. And part of the European restoration agenda is also to restore the land within those protected areas, which will, with the hope, of course, and this is of course a value how we evaluate that in terms of also the efficiency of these measures, that it will contribute to better protection for the species and habitats that these areas should be protected. So some parts of the nature restoration agenda should also contribute towards better protection and hopefully to better effective managed areas. additional to better financing, of course, there's lots of aspects. It's a very complicated subject.
Okay, we have one last question or comment here.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming from Sweden University. I want to break a lance for the approach of the EU, actually, because we have there the site conservation in the Habitats Directive and Birds Directive and the species conservation. The species conservation goes for 100% of the area, actually, and both contribute to the favorable conservation status of species and habitat types. So we have two approaches that both equally contribute to the overall development of biodiversity. And I wonder, what are your ideas for that, to go really for 100% of the area? And personally, I've never understood why not DG Environment is at least also co-responsible for giving agro-environmental scheme money. Yeah, it's still in the agricultural budget. And there is a conflict of interest somehow, I would say. And so what about more ambitious approaches for 100%? Thank you.
Anybody wants to react there?
I mean, I feel, but in general, I think like from our side, I mean, it becomes a optimization problem. That's what it is in the end. We know what we want, we know what is there, but essentially there are many competing objectives that needs to happen in the same amount of land. And obviously, if we want something more, something else has to give. And whatever has to give there, then might, in many cases, step on someone else's foot. It might not be feasible to existing governance or certain tenure systems, for instance, in an area that might prevent this. And so I think we want, of course, more. We want to have this protected area much more ambitious, and we want to achieve the favorable reference values for all the species and habits in Europe. But we also need to realize that it's the incredible challenge that much of this is. Like an easy example for me is always the Netherlands. I mean, Netherlands is one of the densely populated and densely cultivated land areas in all of Europe, and there's very little scope to add additional areas in this country. So how we're actually realizing that is a major challenge, and meeting these favorable reference values for us at the European level as much as possible is definitely the ambition. And but yeah, we also need to the feasibility constraint and the competing land uses that might affect that is, I think, also a big aspect on that. And of course, managing the rest of the land, as also mentioned earlier, besides the 30%, the 70%, we should not forget those. Just protected areas alone won't save a species population. We need to manage the land in Europe in a really more sustainable way. And this also means changing fundamentally our agricultural systems, of course. So there's many aspects of that that obviously need to contribute towards the European biodiversity strategy and reaching its goals.
Okay, you're 3 minutes away from your coffee. I would like to ask each of the panel representatives to give us in less than 1 minute, what is one key takeaway from the sessions up to now? So since 1:30 to now, one key takeaway that you're taking home with you. Milena?
Thank you. So based on all discussions, which according to my opinion was very nice and very useful and very, very important, I would like to say that I think we all agree that it is very important to have good databases and researches, innovative management approaches that will involve the other sectors within the governments, and the way how to integrate the connectivity needs of the protected areas, but also corridors in relation to really determine clear objectives and measures that should be implemented and managed by all different sectors, and also what is very important and necessary cooperation in between these sectors, but also with the local community, and clear communication with all of them on these, let's say, important priorities that should be taken as well and considered as our joint than to just restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. Karel.
So just to close my speech, we all know that the data are very important, so they are a crucial element. The quality of the data is crucial, the quantity also, because the data are not enough anytime. But the more important than that is the building the capacity to understand the data, not only among us, but also among the general public, local communities, especially other sectors. So only in this situation, our data will be used properly and will be implemented in the praxis.
Thank you, Florent.
Yeah, and for my side, we really need not a top-down, but a bottom-up initiative. And I would like just to underline mainstreaming within local authorities and citizens.
Thank you, Florent. Martin, don't tell us about optimizing. Huh?
No, I mean, my aspect, and I mentioned that thing before, I think the key bit that I take away, there are many different standards in Europe. They have been applied for many decades, and we need to build on their successes. We need to incorporate them in this network of protected areas that we want to see in Europe. And we also need to figure out how we can align the different drivers, pressures, and also values across scales, and how the people that, for instance, want protected areas at national or bioreach geographical level, how these values and aspirations are also linked to those that happen, for instance, at the bottom-up level, for instance, at the local farmers who want a protected area not established on their land, of course, because it is their livelihood. So for me, the cross-scale issue and how we align that across the process is really something that is the major challenge. And I think something that I also will take home and spend a lot more things it's also about. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, guys, time for coffee. We will start. Yeah, thank you first. Sorry about that. We will start at 4:29. So be sitting in your seats. So guys online, 4:29, we will start. Enjoy the coffee. Time. While you're sitting, I will ask the people on the panel to already come and sit in those chairs so we gain some time. So panel participants, please. So what are we going to do? Hello again to those people who are online. I hope you had a good coffee break. I can tell you that here it was great. Czech hospitality. So we have one last panel. And then we'll have the conclusion by the star of the day, Hilde. And the panel is really about projects, research projects. And the question is, how can these Biodiversa Plus funded projects support the implementation of the GBF? And for that, we have those great people here. So there is Esther Serrao, from Algarve, the University of Algarve. And she's the coordinator of two projects, Marfo and Restore Seas. And they are funded under Biodiv Dynamics and Biodiv Restore. Then there's Constantina Spiliopoulou. I hope I said your name right, more or less. I trained her. And she's from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. And she coordinates the GAP funded project, which is funded also under Biodiv Protect. And then there's Sigrid Engen from the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, coordinator of Pareus, also on the Biodiv Protect call. Virgilio Hermoso, hello. University of Sevilla, coordinator of Inspire funded project. It's not the Inspire directive, I understand. Also on the Biodiv Protect call, research call, Bastian, whom you know from DG Research and Innovation, and Frédéric Lemaitre from Biodiversa Plus, and he's the Senior Science Society Science Policy Officer, and also from FRB in France. Okay, how are we going to play this? So the objectives, I just told you the objectives. Frédéric is going to set the scene, and then each of the projects will have 5 minutes to explain how they think they can support. And then we'll have Frédéric again, telling us how Biodiversa Plus as a project can support those projects to support the GBF. And the same will be for Bastien from the EC side. And then after that, we'll get the conclusion. Well, you get questions and answers, so be ready. And especially the young people. Anybody's doing a PhD in this group, in this room? Anybody's doing a PhD? No? What did you do with all the PhD people? They're not allowed in these meetings. Anyway, I was going to ask them to ask questions, but if they're not there, they can't ask questions. So what are we going to do? Other minorities, okay. Great, let's start. So Frédéric.
Much. Trust you can hear me well. Yeah. So as introduced by Sibyl, the purpose of this session is and of this forum is to explore how research and innovation can support the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So you all know this framework was adopted in last December. And we have this framework with an ambitious vision for 2030 to curb, to put biodiversity back on the path to recovery. And we have these four strategic goals around conservation, sustainable use, equitable sharing, and implementing this framework. And it's accompanied with a funding model, monitoring and reporting mechanisms. And it gives also a highlight on the role of science and evidence in supporting the implementation of this framework. I would add, and the discussions we've had here today also show that this implementation is neither straightforward nor easy. And we've also seen how a lot of this responsibility of implementing efficiently this framework falls on the shoulder of at the national level, especially when you look at biodiversity strategies and action plans called for under the CBD, for instance. So science and research and innovation can guide implementation. This is the postulate of this our forum, and I wanted to give an example of the importance in the context of this 30% protection objectives of what science can tell us. And to do so, I wanted to use a biodiversity project, which is about marine protected area buffer, and they looked at are all marine protected areas effective, socio-ecologically effective, but I'll focus on the ecological part here. So what they did is they looked at MPA, marine protected area connectivity. They studied over 100 marine protected areas worldwide using these case studies to derive different findings. So they looked at the type of uses allowed in these activities allowed in these protected areas, whether it be fishing, with what gear, whether it be snorkeling, scuba diving, etc. And from there, they identified the role of these regulation levels in ecological effectiveness of these protected areas. And what they found is that partially protected areas are only effective when close by to fully protected areas, which is a key point here. And also they derive from this work on regulation, the typology of marine protected area to assess the potential for ecological performance of this area. And it's for managers, it's used by MedPan and other networks of marine protected area managers. And they use these results to further guide implementation of policy on conservation. For instance, they published so sorry, this is the typology. And they published a paper in One Earth more recently in 2020, showing that in the Mediterranean area, out of the 6% of the area covered by protected area, only 0.23% are actually ecologically effective. So it's an example of how this research goes from local to global levels and back to local, and how you need science to implement effectively these objectives, because despite having these big objectives, if we don't implement them in an informed and evidence-based way, all these efforts could actually go to waste. Now, another example is about bird migrations. We heard about connectivity today, and here, I wanted to highlight the future bird scenarios and GLOBAM projects. They're working on networks of protected area to support migration and soothing tensions around the implementation of these, around these migrations. And typically, so bird scenarios, what they are doing is they are looking at evolution of these nesting and resting areas for migratory species, not only birds, also insects. And they look at how this will evolve over time with climate, and they derive from their guidance for the management of existing protected areas to support these evolutions, and also for the placement of new ones. And there, the Global project, it's about what happens between these migrations. So you have here typically a collision risk, and what they are doing is they are using meteorological stations to anticipate this collision risk and reduce biodiversity loss and economic loss of having to take out wind farms of production. And finally, a last project about bringing visions together, because we know it's not easy to implement protected areas in a crowded and already very used landscape. And I wanted to highlight this Envision project, which through participatory modeling and scenario development methods is working in the landscape level in 4 areas you can see here in Europe and the US. And what they did here is they brought the different actors to develop common visions for the protected area that both reconcile, which are socially acceptable and relevant, which are economically acceptable and relevant, and improve the conservation status of this area. So I hope with this brief overview, I gave you a sort of a first feeling of the type of role research can play in guiding the implementation and the effective implementation, actually achieving these objectives, which are about halting biodiversity loss. And now it's my pleasure to leave the floor to more prospective projects this time, and you can hear with them how they are continuing these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Frédéric. So let's go marine first, huh? Esther, you want to start? Yeah, sorry, we forgot to. That's your job, guys, not mine.
Is this working? Is this working?
It will be working.
It is? Okay. Okay, so
the conservation of genetic diversity between populations, within populations, is in target 4 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And this is one of the main goals of the projects that we have been coordinating, MAR4 and Restore Seas, which are based on marine forests of the oceans. And a major problem to implement this objective of conserving marine population genetic diversity is the missing information about the distribution of genetic diversity between populations and within populations along the ranges of species. It's not just that we don't, this is even worse in the oceans, this problem that we don't know the distribution of population genetic diversity. In many cases, we don't even know the species ranges, let alone the distribution, the diversity below species ranges. Even in cases where information is available and exists, it's not easily available for stakeholders and for people to use, for managers, scientists, citizens, etc. So all these problems all these challenges are targeted by our projects, and the contributions that these projects, MAR4 based on kelp forests and Restore Seas based on a broader definition of forests, which includes also seagrass beds and animal forests, such as forests of corals. We started by creating a framework to compile all the information that exists and to make it available. And so it's just not just compiling all information from databases, literature, etc., but also curating the information, integrating it in ways that are easily available and making it available publicly. This is now available and is becoming updated and continuously, not just for stakeholders and for people to use it for management and for all kinds of utilizations for the industry, for example, but also for citizen science, where we have a network now of a large number of people. We have thousands of volunteers that have been contributing with observations that help to build the biodiversity distribution records. So basically with this information, what we are trying to do is to define key biodiversity areas, but for genetic diversity. What are the hotspots of genetic diversity for marine forests, not just around Europe, but around the planet? Because population genetic diversity
doesn't have borders, right? And Europe is not an island, it's integrated in the world. And so we actually developed this for the entire planet. So when we are here now, this is big data, and all this information is being used as a framework to actually go now to the local level. And we created a specific network of collaborators which are directly involved in the production of data. Okay, so for genetic diversity, to actually sample and do the empirical study of biodiversity, because genetic biodiversity is not visible in the phenotypes. You can't just look at individuals and see it. You have to do more intensive studies. So this implies going to all these sites along the coastlines and involving local institutions, local students, local people in the actual production of work, not just collaborators on the side. They actually we bring students, for example, offer fellowships and involved institutions. So because this is extremely important, this is the key for the continuation, for the sustainability of the program. Because by being involved in the production, we're contributing not just to education and capacitation, we're contributing to this to the targets 20 and 21, which are these sustainable continuation of the capacitation in a way that is not just superficial.
Thank you so much, Esther. I think we can continue. We will listen to all of them and you'll get your comments and questions. Konstantina, you're next.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. There are 5 key points that can support the implementation of Goal D for the GBF. First of all, the GAP project will be mobilizing all available resources, both at the EU level, through open access databases, through data that are available to our partners, but also hopefully through our collaboration with Natura Connect project. But also we'll be mobilizing resources at the national level, specifically in the 5 countries of our consortium, which is Greece, Italy, Spain, Germany, and Denmark. What we want to do in these countries is actually get more detailed data and focus mainly on endemic species. The second point is capacity building. Our project mainly revolves around capacity building. What we aim to do in these 5 countries I just mentioned is to establish national coordination groups for KBAs, and we want to identify the relevant stakeholders and existing networks of collaborations in these countries and use them in order both to establish national coordination group, but also help them take on the work of identifying key biodiversity areas in those countries. The third point for the GAP project is the sharing of experiences. During my PhD this last few years, we have been doing a lot of work in Greece on scoping key biodiversity areas, but also networking, building capacity in this country. And we actually managed in the end of March to make Greece recognize legally key biodiversity areas. And also we appointed an existing committee in the country which was responsible for protected areas to take on the role of the National Coordination Group for Key Biodiversity Areas. And from this experience, one of the key things that that I can share with you, at least right now, is the fact that we used multiple taxonomic groups, meaning both vertebrate animals and invertebrate animals, but also plants. And it seems that at least for Greece, invertebrates, but also plants play a very important role in identifying key biodiversity areas. And what also I can say to you about this work is the fact that a lot of existing KBAs and Natura 2000 sites have, let's say, how do you say that? They actually keep their value. It seems that a lot of the sites that we identified overlap with those sites. But we also managed to identify areas that are outside of the existing network of areas. The fourth point is the sharing of scientific advances. Two main points is that with GAP project, we're trying to fill a few methodological gaps that are present in the identification process of key biodiversity areas. But we will be soon sharing KBA scoping tool that can actually support countries that might lack the necessary knowledge to implement criteria and actually help others to get started with the whole process of identifying key biodiversity areas. And the fifth point is the sharing of knowledge. We aim to, of course, share our results through scientific publications, but also through workshops, both at the 5 countries that are in our consortium, but also at the EU level, where we want to invite all the European member states to participate. And last, we will create a big report on explaining our work and how the KBA tool can be used as guidance or supporting tool to expand the protected area network. Thank you.
Thank you, Constantina. Congratulations for your results in Greece. Sigrid, you're next. I'm sorry, you were drinking.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Sigrid Engen. I'm from Norway. I just came here by airplane today from the very Arctic part of Norway in Tromsø. Sorry, my water was just... I just have to say that I'm not the coordinator of Pareus, the project I'm a member of. It's Dr. Roel May. He couldn't be here today, but I'm stepping in. I just wanted to mention that before I go to, I also have 5 points, how we can contribute to how our project can contribute to mainly to the conservation area-based conservation target of the GBF. The first one is identifying opportunities and barriers for conservation with stakeholders. So in the project Pareus, we are going to look at current conservation practices and land use planning and think about potential improvements together with stakeholders. For example, we would look at opportunities for OECMs, for nature restoration, for including conservation through land use planning, and also for improving existing conservation efforts. And the point number 2 is developing tools, which also was mentioned, to help make knowledge available for decision makers and stakeholders. And in our project, we are going to develop this interactive tool where stakeholders can develop these scenarios for conservation and plan conservation in real landscapes in real time, so they can see what they can plan for conservation and protected area networks, and they can see what happens in terms of conflicts and things like that. So that's what we're going to develop. Also, I thought about developing also these indicators for having that accessible for decision makers in terms of impact or conservation values, and the state of conservation values is also important. So bullet point number 3 is assessing policy coherence. In our project, we will look at policies across different sectors, across different nations, and across, at the EU level and horizontally and vertically, it's said in short. And we have 3 national case studies. So we have middle of Norway, we have southern France, and we have northwestern Slovakia, where we have where we're focusing most of our efforts. And then at the later stages in the project, we're going to look at scaling up. So we're going to assess policy coherence. Do different biodiversity or different legislative or legislation and policies, do they work together, or do they create conflicts and stuff like that? The fourth bullet point is identifying the social and ecological impact of area-based conservation, which was also mentioned, which is really important. We need to focus more about outcomes. And in Pares, we will use existing knowledge, existing data to develop these spatially explicit indicators for biodiversity, for ecosystem and ecosystem services, for example, environmental accounting, but also for measuring conservation impact. And related to the fourth bullet point is the fifth bullet point, and that is identifying restoration areas. We will, for the GBSF says that we need to restore 30% of degraded land, but there is no explicit definition of what degraded means. So we're working on developing methods to spatially identify potential restoration areas and the potential for restoring, so that we can look at or get a quantify the potential for restoring degraded land, and all this in a collaborative way together with stakeholders. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sigrid. And now we have Virgilio.
Hi. Can someone handle the...
Yeah, there is one slide. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm the coordinator of this rather confusing name in the INSPIRE project that stands for Integrated Spatial Planning for across realms for biodiversity, conservation, and human development in a context of change. Making decisions that we've been discussing in the previous session, discussion panel, is rather difficult, especially when we're dealing with multiple objectives that compete for the resources of space in the case of spatial planning. This is a case, obviously, of biodiversity conservation, as it normally takes place in a landscape or seascape that is occupied by other land uses or sea uses that we need to take into account when making decisions where to spend or devote our conservation efforts. This is especially difficult because the way that humans make decisions, cognitive science tells us that as humans, we tend to make decisions that are satisfactory rather than optimal, normally driven by previous experiences, conceptual models, opinions, etc., but not on actually scientific evidence. In our project, we're trying to help improve decision making with information by using this approach called structured decision making. What is it? It's basically rooted in decision theory. Basically, I have tried to simplify it here in 4 simple steps. We need to start by setting objectives, clear objectives that are measurable. Believe it or not, and it might sound quite intuitive, but there are lots of projects where we're trying to actually do things, implement actions without defining previously the objectives. So it is actually really important to define these objectives and targets. What do we want to achieve? Where do we want to go in the future? The next step is to plan. How do we actually get to achieve those objectives and targets? Then we need to act, then we need to implement those plans and revise, monitor whether we're actually achieving our objectives and target or not, and adapt if we're not. In our project, obviously it will be too ambitious to cover the whole structured decision-making cycle in just 3 times. So in this project, we're going to focus on the first 2 of those. We're going to co-design with stakeholders, the relevant stakeholders, management scenarios. What are the objectives that we're pursuing? What are the targets that we want to achieve? Not only focus on biodiversity conservation, but because of biodiversity conservation happens in a widely or a more broad context of socioeconomic activities, we want to also incorporate all those other things like agricultural, energy production, etc. As I said, we want to co-design those with stakeholders so they are relevant to them. Then, as part of the second step, we want to facilitate the decision-making process by generating and developing information and sharing it with those stakeholders that were involved in the previous step. We will do this by, as Martin mentioned before, so we will use models, we will use spatial planning tools to actually deliver information to the stakeholders so they can understand what are the trade-offs between the different objectives that they are pursuing, whether they are achievable or not, what are those trade-offs to help them make decisions. And finally, we want to also communicate not only to those stakeholders that have been involved, but also policymakers and the public in general by developing customized information that are relevant and understandable by these different audiences. And that's it.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to ask Frédéric to tell us how Biodiversa Plus can help the project to help the GBF. Frédéric.
Okay, easy question, by funding them.
Yeah, okay. So now we ask.
Okay, now, so what Biodiversa can do, it's funding them, but it's funding a specific type of projects. I think also it's making space for transdisciplinarity, because transdisciplinarity, it's also time, resources, and importantly, skills. And it's skills which are not part of the classical curricula of scientists. In addition to providing the resources in terms of time, space, money to do this, it's also about providing capacity building and accompanying these dialogues. So we do a lot of work on guides around argumenting, developing the policy relevance of your research. How do you engage stakeholder in practice during the life of your projects? How can you engage stakeholders around the use of scenarios for decision making? These type of things, citizen science, just to name a few. And then I think there's also a key role in Biodiversa, because we've heard it's these projects, it's case studies from which you try to derive also general conclusions and management or practices, findings that you can transfer to somewhere else, and it works more or less depending on the conditions and all this. And so I guess at the level of Biodiversa, we have a real role in facilitating access and use of this knowledge. I think this is through perennity of results and easy access, and that goes a lot through online tools, open access science, aspects like this, which we promote strongly. It's setting up dialogues and sharing expertise, because we know scientists, they will develop a result that works in this case study. Stakeholders, they want knowledge that works for their situation. And there's never a perfect match, except if you were working together early on, but it's not the general situation. So I think in addition to general principles, we can highlight through case studies, which are maybe not exactly adapted to this or that situation. A key aspect is also accessing expertise. And there, well, I guess in science, there's a, you don't want to be caught saying something you're not sure of. On the other hand, a policymaker or manager, it's his job or her job of taking decisions without knowing. And so I think that's one of the divides we have, and we try in these dialogues and also in making the connections on a day-to-day basis when we receive solicitations, bringing the right people in the right place. This is what we try to do. We also work a lot on synthesis of knowledge, of course, itself, through knowledge hubs, through the studies that we order. And then finally, it's also very much about bridging across scales. I think what Biodiversa can do, for instance, this forum, we have global objectives, we have national implementation needs, we have the challenges we've heard from the previous panel, we have the research going on, and I think Biodiversa has a unique place because of our composition of member states, because of our focus and coming from this research and innovation scene and being very engaged into science policy, science society interfacing, we have this unique place to play a fairly informal role also compared to other instances like the EU Biodiversity Platform, for instance. It's fairly informal setting to test out cooperation, collaboration approaches, which are desperately needed to implement these objectives effectively. One example, for instance, is around the work we're doing on monitoring. It's about setting up pilots to see how we can effectively coordinate our respective monitoring efforts, how we can harmonize this toward data that is compatible, that can be aggregated to show something that's meaningful. And it's also about indicators. So for instance, we've heard about the indicators, and indeed, what indicators do people need? What's the data flow? What's the work to do behind this? This is something we're very much engaged on. And yeah, I think I have something, the last thing. No, yeah, that's it. I think the last thing I wanted to raise is you can see this local to, or maybe bottom up and top down, going back top down, for instance, with the example that was highlighted by Hilde around this question on connectivity and the fact that this has been a topic carried by science and embraced by policy also at local levels quite strongly. And now we see this also very strongly at the CBD level with a request to IBES around evidence to implement this. So that would be a bit what we can do. It's really make this link between people who don't necessarily easily talk to each other, whether it be because of where they come from a expertise or a work background, or whether they come from, depending on the level, the geographical scale.
Thank you very much, Frédéric and Bastien. Don't tell me that you can fund them, because we know that. And now, you know, DG Research and Innovation is officially a policy DG. So what can DG Research and Innovation do to support those projects, to support the GBF?
Sure, yeah, I'll try my best. Well, first of all, let's start by saying that, I mean, I echo a lot of what Frederick just said. I mean, I think by setting up the partnership, by co-designing them, co-funding them, we have created a fantastic mechanism that can help us achieve many of the things that otherwise we would have had difficulties, I think, to achieve. And Frederick just outlined many of these very important activities, I think, that need to happen, and where we, through the partnership, but also sometimes in parallel and with other initiatives, we try to achieve all these things. Let me start with a question to the audience. I mean, who in the room has never benefited from some kind of EU support, be it technical, financial, political? Is there anybody who has never had that? You know, please
stand up. Those who never got €1 from the European Union.
I see there was a hand
from the US or Canada or somewhere.
But even then, maybe, okay, there's a person there, but, you know, so I think there's okay, but there is a lot of course, there is a lot of support that has reached you in one way or another. And one thing, of course, is the financial support, and there's a lot of it, and there's maybe around €1 billion a year at the moment, euros going into biodiversity related or relevant activities in the research and innovation agenda. We have these EU missions that I mentioned earlier. We have the European partnerships. We have all the other Horizon Europe actions and projects. But even beyond that, I mean, even beyond our classic research and innovation funding, we have all these other funding mechanisms. Of course, the ERC grants, we have the LIFE program, we have the heaps of money going from our colleagues in the international partnerships to the rest of the world, and not to within Europe, and there have been really important and fantastic initiatives also in relation to protected areas and biodiversity in African, Caribbean and Pacific countries and beyond. And I was involved in one of that initiative in recent years, and that initiative helped to develop knowledge hubs around the world, and Bioparma it's called, and where we work together with IUCN. And I think it just shows that it's not just the core research funding, but there is a lot of other support, financial support coming. And now, again, looking back at just the research and innovation funding, there's over 100 active projects, and it's really difficult for us to keep track of them and to actually see what's happening that we are currently funding and supporting in one way or another. And we're a small team of just 6 people in our unit, trying to keep on top of all these biodiversity nature-based solutions related projects. And also, of course, in parallel, there is lots of events that we are supporting and policy processes. So it's quite a task, but I think the financial support is very important, but it's not the only thing. At the technical level, at the project management level, I should acknowledge that, the project officers in the research executive agency and other agencies, also in the other policy DGs, the policy officers, we are trying to follow as much as possible and provide support to all the projects and initiatives and link them up with relevant policy processes and events. And that in itself is a big job. We have, of course, also the European research infrastructures and information systems and platforms and portals that we try to link with the project activities, where we try to host results coming from research. We have established this knowledge center for biodiversity. We are in the process, together with the BioAgora project, to establish a science service for biodiversity. All of these initiatives, they will I think support researchers in the field, but also will depend on support from these researchers in the field to feed them with relevant results and inputs. Then very importantly, of course, we have the political level, right, where we are there to help creating enabling conditions to design policies together with the other policy DGs that are research friendly, but that also, identify clearly the knowledge needs for these policies that help closing the loop between research and policy. And I think the new proposed nature restoration law is a very good example of that, where we had a very strong science input in the design and development of this law, and also will have reserved a very, very critical role for researchers and research to feed back on the implementation of this. And this feedback is also important, of course, for all the evaluation and monitoring that we do, and for adapting policies as needed. Well, that's clearly a very critical role also of all the science and research we fund. As I mentioned earlier today, we have also designed now this new EU biodiversity governance landscape, where the researchers, the different initiatives, expert groups, and so they play a key role and support us in an ongoing fashion. And then last but not least, I think at the international level and transnational level, we, through our research program, we very strongly encourage all these partnerships, linkages, scientific collaboration. We ourselves organize clustering events with our REA colleagues, stakeholder events. We support science policy events to close this feedback loop. And then finally, also to make the link to international policy mechanisms such as IPBES, and then through IPBES again to CBD. So I think there's support on all fronts. It could always be more, but we are in an exciting point in time, I think, where we have a lot of things in place that we need to make to work, and that can really help us to implement the GBF and help us mobilize research to support the implementation of the GBF.
Thank you, Bastian. A lot of enthusiasm. So all we need is that you become Director General for Research. Things will go even better. Okay, your turn, audience, to come in with questions, comments. If you address your question to one of the panel members, please identify her or him. And I immediately have two there and then there. I don't know where's the other mic. Please, just
okay.
It will work at some point.
Okay. My name is Cristiano Vernesi. I come from Italy, Fondazione Bumac. I'm a conservation geneticist, so I was pleased to receive your comments about your project. I just would like to mention one important aspect, probably not so well known. I think science is here to provide also solution, as long as we acknowledge that there's a complexity, so we shouldn't be afraid of that complexity. But for instance, coming back to your point about genetic diversity, now there is a headline indicator for genetic diversity, which is the proportion of population with an effective population size above 500. And I would like to state that this indicator has been developed taking into account the fact that many countries can't access to DNA-based data. As long as you can have good census size data, you can approximate, of course. So what I'd like to say is that, as you mentioned, probably in the previous time, it was only through DNA-based data, but we can actually assess the genetic diversity within a population. But nowadays, we can implement some indicators that can take already into account the uncertainty in providing this kind of data. But of course, we are all here to provide the most updated scientific information. So I totally agree with you when you say that it's also important to keep collecting samples for empirical verification of our, especially our models. Because sometimes I fear that this kind of reductionist approach in which you model everything, but sometimes you just end up in maps and you see, okay, but in this place, I didn't see any single animal. So why I should, you know, it's important to maintain the relationship between empirical and a kind of reductionist approach. So to this end, I think the inclusion of genetic diversity in the Global Biodiversity Framework is really one of the major breakthroughs. So I would like to thank you for pinpointing this. Thank you.
Thank you. Esther, do you want to react to that?
Is this working?
Yeah, it should. They all work.
Thank you for your very good question. And I'm really happy that you mentioned that. It is these indicators in these sort of round numbers make no sense if you really understand the complexity of genetic diversity. These days we have much more information beyond that. In particular, if we talk about the oceans, we have so many populations, for example, they are clonal and that reproduce in alternative ways, and the traditional methods developed for population biology are not applicable to a lot of real biodiversity. In addition, we have the holobionts, for example, the microbiomes that are associated with organisms. So an organism is a community that has genetic diversity also related with their microbial life and all that. And this is something where it's actually a very good outcome of the Biodiversa project by promoting the activities in which we discuss with the stakeholders and with the people that need to use our information. We discover that there's so much need for people to understand genetic diversity by talking with, for example, in our project, we talk with the aquaculture industry, we talk with conservation institutes, we talk with different industry that are concerned about, even with fishermen. A lot of people don't understand these things about biodiversity, genetic diversity, and really want to have questions that are real applied science. So we have to make sure that the applied science is actually applicable. And the only way to do this is to go and talk with the people that need to apply it. We can't work on this just sitting on our desks and making policy and not talking with the people directly, because they have real questions and real applications. And for example, the microbiomes, this is one of the things I learned with the industry in aquaculture when we go and visit them and talk to them. There are all these emergent properties, all these emergent questions that only arise when we have this interaction between the scientists and the stakeholders, and they come up with their problems, and we never thought about that because these are really interesting. And for example, they say, well, okay, when we use when we use the water that's already full of biodiversity, instead of using different conditions, we will have less disease. Why is that? So then we start understanding that it's the genetic diversity involved in their production. So they actually have empirical information about the use of genetic diversity. They just don't call it that way, but by talking to them, we discover interesting results which the actual stakeholders already knew before us and before we went to study. And they know, okay, we know we have less disease if we use these diverse systems in aquaculture, for example. If we reuse the water that's already full of bacteria, then we don't get this disease and that disease. And wow, that's fantastic. They already did the experiments for us. And then we start this interaction. It's been really fruitful. And this is also actually a result of this project, because we try to go and talk to the stakeholders directly, and we discover these things, and it goes beyond. So it is very important, the empirical, this thing that you just mentioned, talking with people directly and finding what are their problems and the solutions. We learn a lot about them. The same thing with fishermen, for example, when we want to know about species ranges, they know a lot of information, and they will involve us directly in discovering this, and they will contribute to it. So we have in our projects, we have communities of fishermen that are collecting data on the distribution of corals, for example, at 200 meters depth, where you couldn't easily go and sample, and they collect information themselves when they bring their nets, and they have these corals, and they actually add it to our databases. We have collaborations, for example, with...
Esther, I'm going to cut you, because when geneticists start talking about real people with real questions, they never stop. This gentleman here, sorry, Esther. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I am Nicholas Ozo from the African Technology Policy Studies Network based in Nairobi, Kenya. Thanks. My question is directed to Sigrid, and I'm interested in your policy coherence approach, which you said you are going to use to assess the 3 regions that you mentioned in Norway. My question is, have you prioritized certain sectors for the assessment of this policy coherence across the 3 regions, and which sectors have you prioritized and why? Again, I would like to know the benchmark of the policy frameworks that you are going to use. Will it be based on the GBF alone or on the national policies that are governing biodiversity within Norway? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure if I can answer it in a thorough way, because we haven't really, the project is just starting out, and I'm not the PI. So I'm basically, yeah, we're just starting, but very relevant questions. I don't think we have any sectors identified. I guess it's going to be the different national and in the European and the local policies. We have a lot of focus on land use planning. So I guess I can just imagine for a Norwegian context, we have a lot of focus on the land use planning tools and how to operate that. We have a lot of people involved in the project that are good with this new environmental accounting and using that for in the UN this new standard and have operationalized that. But I can't, there's this tool called Policy Coherence Matrix that we're going to use that Dr. Roel has used before. So I'm not sure if I'm going to answer that more thoroughly than that, but I can come back to that at a later date.
Thank you. Great question. We have questions from the online gang.
Yes, so I will again combine a little bit. So the first question is, for all of you, do you anticipate any clashes of interest between stakeholders within the domains of your projects? And do you have any strategies to foster dialogue and mitigate risks related to those clashes of interest? And related to this is also, what is the role of social sciences and humanities in your project? Are professionals and institutions from these disciplines partners of the project and co-participating in the design and execution?
So conflicts and social sciences and humanities, who wants to start? Esther? Then we'll go down the road.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but the conflict in terms of genetic diversity, population genetic diversity, a common conflict that we have, which is a little bit related to the lack of information, is between restoration and conservation of genetic diversity, because often restoration plans are not taking into account the genetic diversity, and they could contribute to actually the impoverishment of genetic diversity if you do restoration without taking this into consideration and planting monocultures. Well, you all would understand it's based on monocultures of a single species. Well, based on genetic diversity is the same thing. You have to take into account what are the sources and what is the diversity of what is being planted or whatever it is. And so this there is a conflict between restoration and the conservation of habitat sometimes, because also by doing, for example, forestry on lands, you know that it's going to change one ecosystem into another ecosystem. If you have shrubland and you plant a forest, you transform one ecosystem into another ecosystem. And this can be, it can be argued that the shrubland had some biodiversity values that will be changed if you plant a forest. In the oceans, now there's a lot of fashion for planting forests in the oceans, and without taking into account what is the shrubland. They are natural ecosystems that also have very strong biodiversity value, but is not visible and is not, people are not educated complicated to understand it. So it's very important to understand this. Restoration is very important, but let's think well about restoration, that we're not destroying one ecosystem because we give more value to another ecosystem. We might think there's a certain ecosystem that produces a lot of carbon restoration, but maybe it's not the best for biodiversity. Maybe we're destroying biodiversity to do carbon restoration. So there's a lot to be discussed there. So I won't go in further because if I'm
Thank you, Esther. Conflicts, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, conflicts, yeah, conflicts and conservation is a big topic, but I was just thinking the term, the other effective area-based conservation measures is really a way of trying to get around or mitigate conflicts. So that's going to be something that's really new in Norway and everywhere else, and trying to figure out how this concept will apply to a Norwegian case, but also the other cases, and how that can also mitigate conflicts. So that's going to be an interesting avenue to pursue. Also, we have something that I'm also concerned about, a lot of conflicts revolving around indigenous issues now in Norway. We have this conflict with the establishment of a big windmill farm in our case study area. So I'm also curious about, we haven't really discussed, our project is really, we haven't really started our project, so we haven't really discussed this issue, but how we're going to incorporate the indigenous concerns, which is a really huge topic, also in relation to IPBES and the OECMs, and how the Sami, which is the indigenous people of Norway, and are interested in having indigenous areas included as an OECM potentially, but of course that doesn't have to, there has to be in an inclusive way, not in the same way that traditional top-down conservation has been done in the past. Social sciences, yes, we have a lot of social scientists in the project, so I think that's fairly covered.
Thank you, Constantina.
Yes, as already mentioned, I think that conservation and conflict kind of go together, especially when you have a lot of players that have different interests. Lucky for us in our project, it's the fact that identifying key biodiversity areas is based on ecological criteria, and conflicts that arise, they're a next step. So what we're going to do to handle those conflicts in the next step is the establishment of the national coordination groups. Kind of one of the main essence of this national coordination groups is to actually be involved in national policies and try to safeguard those areas and support the livelihood of those areas and the biodiversity that they're identified based on. Yeah.
Thank you. Virginia?
I would like to start with the role of social sciences in decision making, and I think it is actually critical because by sharing information is not the same as knowledge transfer. So there's always a gap in between what type of information I'm sharing and whether the audience that I've got in front of me, in this case stakeholders, are actually going to take up that information and use it for making the decision. So we need to understand how those stakeholders involved in the decision-making process actually make decisions and how they think and how to actually offer them the information they need and in the form and the shape that they need. So they will find it useful and then use it in the decision-making process. Regarding the conflict, obviously, yes, there's always conflict. Conservation biology is a discipline of crisis, and we need to deal with those conflicts, uncertain information, and so on. Martin has presented a potential way around those conflicts, and it's through adequate planning. So if we manage to get everyone agree on particular goals and understand the trade-offs between those goals and objectives, hopefully we can facilitate the decision making and negotiation between how much I'm willing to lose, so you can gain a little bit more. And that's it.
Thank you so much. We take one last comment or question from Didier.
Yes, it's a remark and a question, perhaps more for Bastian and perhaps Francisco. First of all, as mentioned by Sibyl, 25 years ago, there is no support from the EU and the Commission concerning the research on biodiversity. So we are very lucky now. We have a lot of support. We need more for sure, but that's it. My question is more about the incoherence of some policy at the EU level. So first of all, is there any institution or process to identify incoherence in EU policies in your topic, in research and innovation, and perhaps in the other sectors? Of course, I have some sectors in mind, like agriculture and fisheries, but is there any official way or place where this incoherence is discussed and managed?
Yeah, also very good question, very pertinent. There are mechanisms. I mean, actually, with the previous questions about stakeholder clashes of interests and so on, I was thinking there is no secret that even within the Commission, we have clashes of interests between different policy DGs and policies and all of this. So it's quite challenging. But when it comes to the research and innovation work and programming and so on, of course, there is now also the do no significant harm principle that we have to apply. And where the idea is that, also other initiatives relating to agriculture, to forestry, to other sectors, they don't do significant harm to biodiversity, and the biodiversity has now really, I think, a central role through the Green Deal, through the biodiversity strategy in this whole construct. Whether or not it's effective, it's another question. I think we know from the CAP, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy, there's still challenges. And earlier today, somebody mentioned also that there is a lot more money going still into that, and maybe we need also money for doing some more biodiversity monitoring, but that shouldn't come from the CAP and things like that, because there is also a conflict of interest in that already. So, but we have mechanisms. We co-design, we co-create a lot of the research, not all of it, but the research programming. And that means, we have also have, of course, inter-service consultations. We ourselves, we get a lot of requests now to input on everything, to do with agriculture, forestry. So there are many means of ensuring that internally, but it doesn't always mean that we are effective at doing it, and I think that's also an area where we can still improve a lot, and where we need to see in the coming years that we ensure that we don't, on the one hand, damage biodiversity through indirect or direct other activities, while we are at the same time providing record funding for biodiversity and push research for biodiversity policy and so on. So I think there is generally still an issue there. Francisco might want to, I don't know if you want to add to it. No, okay.
Thank you. Before we close this session, I would like to ask each panelist very shortly. You have an option. Either you tell us one key takeaway that you will take home for yourself from the whole afternoon, or if you prefer, you tell us one thing that you do in your project and that you think every project should be doing, because this is the super idea. So you have a choice, and we'll start with Frédéric because he's not talking about a project, so he has to go with the key takeaway. Less than 1 minute each.
Okay, from the afternoon, I take away, well, I hope you'll take away the need for scientific evidence to guide policy and action in implementing this global biodiversity framework. What I would take away personally is the need beyond this for cooperation. We've heard on many instances how we cannot implement 30% each on our own and hope for it to work. And we will have to find technical and political solutions to this. Some of these elements we have, some of these we still have to find.
Thank you. We go down the line. So, Bastian.
Yeah, okay, I think, well, it's maybe two things. So one is that we want the EU to lead on this, right? Globally, but also within the EU. We need to lead by example, and we also need this, very high quality research funded by the EU or where the EU collaborates to make a difference in all of that. And that's very important. And we see a lot of that great research being presented here today and also hopefully tomorrow. And that's very good. The second one is more of a concern, I think, for me is we're talking a lot about spatial scales, but time scales are also really critical here. And we have the challenge that a lot of things need to happen very, very quickly and at a very large scale. And we need solutions now and implement these solutions and upscale these solutions, whereas by the very nature of research, things take time. And that's, I think, something where we need to find compromises, where we need to really speed up the feedback from research, ongoing research projects, even planned research still, back into the policy cycle, because otherwise we'll find ourselves, in 5 or 10 years time with a lot more research results, but maybe too late to make another difference yet again, for 2030 or even later. So I think that we also need to be very careful about and all work together that we break these barriers that are there in terms of the timing and make good use of opportunities that are there right now, including the national pledges and all of that.
Thank you, Esther.
Okay, as a take-home message from today, so we in the science, we are very interested in doing excellent science, but this program is for applied science, and to make it applicable to stakeholders, I think there's two things that I highlight. One is here the interaction between terrestrial and marine systems in terms of stakeholders is not as developed as within each of these realms. And in the case of marine ecosystems, for example, it's highly based on marine protected areas, and what destroys, for example, marine forests and what protects them is not marine protected areas, is the terrestrial management. So to conserve marine forests, we need a terrestrial management, not to destroy forests. And people don't understand this. People don't understand that if they destroy terrestrial vegetation in the mountains, they'll have less fish in the ocean, because that's all those particles and all of that. That's what's going to affect the coastlines. And the second one is that for stakeholders to be involved, we need more outreach. There's a lot of, let's say, inbreeding, where we talk to each other. We're all here very interested in these topics, and we hear about them, we understand them, and we continue talking to each other. So we need the outreach to go outside and we need to reach, and that's what we learn also by going to actually working in sites where we talk to people who wouldn't come to these meetings, would not be online here listening to this meeting. So a lot of the stakeholders are not going to come to us. We're not, by doing panels and workshops and so on, we're not going to get them because they're not going to come to us. We have to go to them. So we need to find ways to actually reach people who are totally uninterested in this, and because they will be very interested if we talk to them, and then they have a lot of interesting things to tell us, and we'll have a lot to learn with them. But we have to actually go and find them and talk to them directly, and not just expect that they're going to read our briefings, our policy briefings, or come and watch us talking here.
Okay, coming out of the ivory tower. Yes, good idea. We continue.
Yeah, no, the one thing I just want to mention is that and what's unique about our project is the landscape approach and thinking about the whole landscape. And we can't think just about the 30%. We have to think about, we need the whole Earth solution. I read that in a Parks Journal article once. I thought that was really nice. We need 30% high quality areas for biodiversity, and we need sustainable use in the 70% of the remainder of the area. We can't just focus on the 30% and leave it and then just do what we want in the rest of the 70%. So that's what we're doing in Paredes. We're trying to think about the landscape as a whole, combining different ways of conservation with protected areas, OECMs, nature restoration, and land use planning. So
great, thank you. Constantina.
Yes, so I think that one key takeaway would be that capacity building is actually very important. There's so many people around the world working on conservation that they don't have access, or they cannot have access to meetings like this or expertise or anything like that, but they actually do know what happens on the ground. So we need to reach them, we need to train them, and then we need to start working from the bottom up to actually achieve our goals.
Thank you so much. Last but not least,
Because we're facing increasingly complex decisions with the really ambitious goals that we have set for 2030 or 2050, we need to find a way to improve the decision-making process and go around the quite common opportunistic decision-making. And we need to do that, to go around that problem. We need to enhance how we use scientific evidence in the decision-making process. And for that to be effective, as I just mentioned before, the role of social sciences is really important to actually ensure that we are working towards transferring our knowledge and not just sharing the information that as scientists we are producing in our ivory tower.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank the panel with you. You have to thank the panel. Thank you so much. We have 15 minutes left. So what are we going to do? Hilda is going to take the floor and she's going to start concluding. Then will you have a chance to reflect a little bit for a few minutes about your afternoon, and then we get the final word from Hilda.
So yeah, thanks again for all of you and to all the speakers for providing this very inspiring context on the Global Biodiversity Framework. I think it's very clear for us that we do have still lots of challenges ahead when it comes to the spatial planning and also to these cross-scale issues that Martin has referred to several times, also to getting good quality data to track progress towards the targets, information to develop the indicators, and also to further support the implementation and to do the mainstreaming, because indeed we also need to get these remaining 70% right. But I think also from today we heard that we had several testimonies to show that indeed the science can also provide us with the solutions that we need. And I think it was also interesting to hear about these challenges and these success stories by or from different perspectives, from the CBD Secretariat, from the KBA partnership, from the European Commission, from the different scientific projects, and then of course also from the individual countries. After all, we are still a member state driven initiative, so that is very important, that we do hope that these type of events can also help to develop these national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And I think possibly this is also the power of these type of events, these type of science policy fora, that can indeed be complementary to maybe the more formal settings that we also have in the European scene. So we definitely want to further develop these type of events. I also hope that this forum was an opportunity for the Biodiv Protect projects to learn a bit more about the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I would like to thank again Julian for this very brilliant and clear presentation on the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I also hope that for the projects, it will become more clear how they can contribute during the rollout of their projects, but also through collaboration with other projects, which will also be dealt with later on this week. And then from the Biodiversa Plus side, it's definitely very motivating for us to hear that there is already lots of good science out there, including science supported by previous Biodiversa calls. We had so many in the past. Also, we have a few ones that are still running on biodiversity and climate change, biodiversity restoration, on biodiversity scenarios. So we also want to harvest all this information as one of our activities. But then it's also clear that there's lots of work ahead. And what we would like to do with Biodiversa Plus is building on this Science Policy Forum to develop like a long-term strategy of how Biodiversa Plus can contribute to the Global Biodiversity Framework, but really doing that in a very coherent manner across all the activities of Biodiversa Plus. And I think Frédéric already nicely summarized the different streams of work that align with the Global Biodiversity Framework. First of all, of course, the research that we fund, these transnational projects, these transdisciplinary projects. And here I would like to highlight that it's not only indeed this the Biodiv Protect call that we are focusing on this week, But we have a new call running, which is on biodiversity monitoring. The third call that we will launch in September will be focusing on nature-based solutions. The fourth call will be focusing on transformative change. So there's lots of exciting avenues ahead and lots of new research that we expect that can feed also the Global Biodiversity Framework. And we also hope to further reinforce the role of citizen science in these projects. When it comes to the biodiversity monitoring activities, I think there will be a big focus indeed of Biodiversa Plus in operationalizing solutions that are developed by other projects, and also to reinforce the use of biodiversity monitoring data, both by researchers, but also by policymakers, both private and public. Lots of things that we can do, of course, also at the science policy interface. Including supporting capacity for scientists to do the interfacing themselves. We fully realize that this is not a given, and we need to help them, for example, by setting up the summer schools, like we do with Alternet, developing guides, but also organizing very specific trainings. Of course, we can also act as a knowledge brokers ourselves as Biodiversa Plus, and the fact that we have both these ministries of research and the Ministries of Environment on board of Biodiversa Plus is really helping us to bridge between these two communities. Lots of things that we can also do when it comes to feeding IPES. We heard that there may be very excellent opportunities when it comes to, for example, an IPES assessment on spatial planning, on ecological connectivity, on biodiversity monitoring. So these could be excellent opportunities for the projects that we have here, but also for past projects to feed the results. But also the other way around, we are very eager to work with IPES to identify the knowledge gaps in existing assessments and to bring it back to the research programming and funding and to the work of Biodiversa Plus. So we really think this two-way interaction is very important. We can possibly also play a role when it comes to setting up the national hubs. Maybe not only in terms of setting up new hubs, but identifying structures that are already existing, maybe to support different functions and that are used for different purposes. And I think that could maybe also help the rollout of the key biodiversity areas and to help to set up these national coordination groups. Lots of things that we can also do that are maybe a bit more on the soft side, working on enabling conditions. I am a very strong believer in open science, so there's lots of work that we can do there, also joining forces with the Global Biodiversity Information Facility and other research infrastructures, and also to support stakeholder engagement to indeed make sure that we can reach this whole of society approach of the Global Biodiversity Framework and overcome the clashes that you refer to. Not only activities and approaches, but also the topics that we focus on, I think are very important. And there are possibly a few topics where we can lift the importance, and the ones that I picked up from today's discussion are the one on genetic diversity. And also, I think we have to more clearly focus on the global dimension of biodiversity and the impact that we have as EU on global biodiversity. So I hope that Biodiversa will really also increase the efforts on these topics. And then the last thing I would like to say is that we are huge, but we are not the only actor in the landscape, and we fully recognize that. So we are very open to collaborate with other projects, with other partnerships, with this global knowledge support service, with the science service, and with anyone who is out there. We are very eager to do that together. I was actually laughing a bit when you were referring to the fact that like 2 decades ago, there was like no biodiversity mentioned in the framework program of the Commission. And actually, when I started my job in 2012, my very first meeting was a meeting at the European Commission where we were complaining about it. So it's 10 years ago. And I think now we have come a long way, because now we have this partnership, we have all these opportunities, we have all these partners that want to work together. And I think we really have to embrace this momentum. So in terms of conclusion, I will leave it here.